Hello everyone. I know you used this video to fall asleep, but before you do, let me know where you're from and what time you're watching. Now just get cozy and enjoy. I used to sleep like a log. Not a care in the world could disturb me once I shut my eyes. That was until a few weeks ago when the scratching started. It wasn't just any scratching though. It was persistent, unnerving, like claws on wood. It would wake me up in the dead of night, always around 3 o'clock a.m., and I'd lie there, wide-eyed with the blankets pulled up to my chin, listening. At first, I thought it was rats. The idea wasn't comforting, but at least it was rational. So, I went out, bought traps, and set them all around the house. I even put some under the bed, but the scratching continued. Night after night, that sound would yank me out of sleep, setting my nerves on edge. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was dark, too dark, as if the shadows were pressing in on me. I could hear the scratching beneath me, soft but deliberate. It almost sounded like something was trying to spell out a message. My breath caught in my throat. The idea seemed absurd, but I couldn't shake it. Slowly, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and lowered myself to the floor. I took a deep breath and lifted the edge of the bed skirt. The flashlight in my hand shook as I shone it into the darkness beneath the bed. And that's when I saw it. The floorboards beneath the bed were covered in scratches. At first, they looked random, just deep grooves in the wood. But as I looked closer, I realized they weren't random at all. They were letters, words, carved into the floorboards. I scrambled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. It said, "I see you." A shiver ran down my spine. My mind raced with explanations, but none of them made any sense. I tried to convince myself it was just a prank, but who would go to such lengths? And how would they get under my bed without me noticing? The next day, I took a closer look at the scratches. They were deep, as if made by something strong, something determined. I tried to sand them down, but they were too deep, almost as if they were part of the wood now. I covered them with a rug and tried to forget about it, but that night, the scratching returned, louder than before. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. When the sun finally rose, I felt like I was going mad. I went to work, exhausted and distracted. My coworkers noticed, asked if I was okay, but I just brushed them off. How could I tell them about the scratching under my bed? Days turned into weeks, and the scratching never stopped. It was relentless, almost mocking. I started sleeping on the couch, but even then, I could hear it. It was like the sound was following me, seeping into my mind. I felt like I was losing grip on reality. One night, I decided enough was enough. I was going to find out what was causing this, even if it killed me. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and a flashlight and marched into my bedroom. I yanked the rug away and dropped to my knees. The scratches were still there, but now they were different. There were more words, a whole sentence. "Look below the house." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I knew my house had a crawl space, but I'd never been down there. The entrance was in the basement, a small square hole with a flimsy wooden cover. I stood there, staring at it, my hands trembling. It took every ounce of courage I had to pry the cover open. The smell hit me first, damp, musty, like something rotting. I gagged but forced myself to keep going. I shone the flashlight into the darkness below. The beam caught on something shiny, something metal. It looked like a small, old-fashioned key lying there in the dirt. I hesitated, then reached down and grabbed it. The metal was cold and heavy in my hand. I had no idea what it was for, but it felt important, like it was meant for me to find. I climbed out of the crawl space, my heart still pounding in my chest. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the key. What did it unlock? And why was it under my house? I had so many questions, but no answers. The scratching started again around 3 o'clock a.m., just like clockwork. But this time, it was different. It was frantic, almost desperate, like whatever was under there knew I had the key. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed, grabbed the key, and ran to the basement. I knew there was only one place left to look, the old locked trunk that had been sitting in the corner of the basement since I moved in. I'd never bothered with it before. It was old and covered in dust, and I figured it was just junk left behind by the previous owner. But now, it felt like the trunk was calling to me. My hands were shaking as I slid the key into the rusty lock. It clicked open with a soft, metallic sound. I hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside, there were old photographs, yellowed with age. I picked one up and felt my blood run cold. It was a picture of a family, parents and a little girl. They were standing in front of my house, but it looked different, older. The little girl was smiling, but her eyes seemed empty, almost haunting. Beneath the photographs, there was a diary. The leather cover was cracked and faded, but the pages inside were surprisingly intact. I flipped through it, skimming the entries. It was written by the little girl's mother. She talked about their new house, how happy they were. But then, the entries took a dark turn. She wrote about hearing noises at night, scratching sounds coming from the walls. She thought it was rats, but then she found the messages, just like I did. She started seeing things, shadows moving in the corners of her vision. She tried to tell her husband, but he didn't believe her. The last entry was the worst. She wrote about her daughter waking up one night, screaming. She said something was under her bed, something with glowing eyes. They never found the girl. She just vanished, without a trace. I dropped the diary, my heart racing. The scratching sound seemed to echo around me, louder and louder. I ran upstairs, the key still clutched in my hand. I knew I had to get out of the house. Whatever was under my bed, it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. But when I reached the front door, it wouldn't open. I tugged and pulled, but it was like the door was glued shut. Panic set in. I ran to the windows, but they were sealed tight too. I was trapped. The scratching sound was deafening now, like nails on a chalkboard. I could hear it coming up the stairs, getting closer and closer. I ran to the bedroom, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the flashlight. The message on the floorboards had changed again. Now it said, "Come say." I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. I knew I didn't have a choice. Whatever it wasn't going to leave me alone. I got down on my hands and knees and peered under the bed. At first I didn't see anything, just darkness. But then something moved. Two glowing eyes stared back at me, unblinking. They were filled with a malevolent hunger that made my blood run cold. A hand reached out, long fingers scraping against the floorboards. I scrambled back, but I could feel it pulling me in, dragging me closer. The last thing I remember was the sound of my own screams, echoing through the empty house. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold, hard floor. My head was throbbing, and I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. I looked around, disoriented, and then I saw it. The floorboards were covered in scratches, deep and jagged. They spelled out a single word. Stay. I don't know what happened that night. I don't know what that thing was, or why it's in my house. All I know is that I'm never leaving. I can't. The scratching has stopped, but now I hear whispers, soft and insistent, telling me to come back, to look under the bed. I know I shouldn't, but the urge is getting stronger. It's like a compulsion, an itch I can't scratch. I don't know how much longer I can hold out. I feel it, watching me, waiting. I can't sleep, I can't eat, I can't think of anything else. I'm trapped, and I know there's no way out. So if you're reading this, please, don't come looking for me. Don't come to this house. It won't let you leave. It's hungry, and it's waiting. And it knows you're here. I've always loved photography. There's something magical about capturing a moment in time, freezing it forever. That's why our house is filled with family photos, pictures from vacations, birthdays, and random days when I just felt like documenting our lives. My husband, Alex, would tease me, saying I was obsessed, but he secretly loved it too. And our daughter, Emma, she would always put on her brightest smile whenever I pulled out the camera. It all started a few weeks ago. I was going through an old photo album, reminiscing about the days when Emma was just a toddler. I turned a page, and there it was, a photo of us at the beach. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the sand. Alex had his arm around me, and Emma was playing in the sand in front of us. But something felt off. I leaned closer. There, standing a few feet away from us, was a man. He wasn't someone I recognized. His face was turned slightly away, but I could see he was staring at us. I tried to remember if there was anyone around when we took that picture, but I couldn't recall anyone being there. I brushed it off as a coincidence, maybe just a stranger passing by. But a chill ran down my spine that I couldn't shake off. The next day, I went through more albums. At first, everything seemed normal. But then, in a picture from Emma's first birthday party, there he was again, the same man, standing in the background, his face still partially hidden. My heart started to race. Who was he? Why was he in our photos? I decided to show Alex that evening. "Look at this," I said, handing him the album. "Do you see that man?" Alex squinted at the picture. "Yeah, looks like someone at the party. Why?" "No, Alex, look at this one." I flipped to the beach photo. "He's in this one too." Alex frowned. "Maybe he's a family friend." "I don't know, Sarah. It's weird, but I'm sure there's an explanation." But there wasn't. I went through every single photo we had, and he was in all of them. Always in the background, always partially hidden, always watching. The more I looked, the more I felt like I was being watched. The man never aged, never changed his clothes. He was a constant, a dark shadow in our lives that I had never noticed before. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, his dark figure lurking behind us, his eyes fixed on us. I kept telling myself it was just a coincidence, just some trick of the light or a flaw in the photos. But I knew that wasn't true. The next day, I took one of the photos to a friend of mine who was a photographer. I wanted to see if she could find any explanation, any rational reason for this. She took one look at the photo and her face turned pale. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice shaky. "It's from my album." "Why?" She shook her head. "I don't know, Sarah. This doesn't make any sense. The lighting, the shadows, they're all wrong. This man, he shouldn't be there." "What do you mean?" I asked, feeling a knot form in my stomach. "He's not part of the original photo," she said, pointing at the man's figure. "Look, the shadows don't match. He's been added in somehow, but I don't know how." I left her studio feeling more confused and scared than ever. If he wasn't part of the original photo, then how did he get there? And why was he in every single one? That night, I had a nightmare. I was in a dark room, surrounded by our family photos. They were all hanging on the walls, and as I walked closer, I saw that the man was in every single one. He was no longer in the background. He was in the foreground, his face twisted into a cruel smile. He reached out from the photos, his hands clawing at me, trying to pull me in. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just ignore this. I needed answers. The next day, I decided to take a new family photo. I set up the camera on a tripod in our living room and gathered Alex and Emma. "Just one more, okay?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. They smiled as I pressed the timer and rushed to join them. The camera clicked, and I felt a moment of relief. Maybe, just maybe, this one would be normal. I checked the photo on the camera screen, and my blood ran cold. He was there, standing right behind us, his hand resting on my shoulder. I dropped the camera, my hands shaking. "Mommy, are you okay?" Emma asked, her big brown eyes filled with concern. I forced a smile. "Yes, sweetie, I'm fine." But I wasn't. I wasn't fine at all. I spent the next few days obsessing over the photos. I tried everything, burning them, tearing them up, even deleting the digital copies. But every time I looked at them again, they were intact, and he was still there, watching us. I started to see him everywhere, in the mirror, in the shadows, even in my dreams. He was always there, lurking, waiting. I felt like I was losing my mind. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I was constantly on edge, waiting for him to appear. One night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a noise coming from the living room. It was a faint whisper, followed by a soft laugh. I grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs, my heart racing. The living room was empty, but the photos on the walls were different. The man was no longer in the background. He was standing with us, his face clear and terrifying. His eyes were dark, empty, and his smile sent chills down my spine. And then I saw it. In one of the photos, Emma was missing. She was gone, replaced by the man. I felt my knees give way as I sank to the floor, tears streaming down my face. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be happening. I rushed to Emma's room, my heart pounding. She was there, sleeping peacefully in her bed. I let out a shaky breath and backed away, my mind racing. I had to protect her. I had to find a way to stop this. I spent the next few days researching everything I could about supernatural occurrences, haunted photos, anything that could explain what was happening. But nothing made sense. There was no way to stop him, no way to get rid of him. And then one night, I heard Emma's voice. She was talking to someone in her room. I pushed open the door, and there he was, sitting on the edge of her bed, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. "Mummy, this is my friend," Emma said, her voice sleepy. "He's been watching over us." I felt a scream rise in my throat, but I couldn't make a sound. I watched as he turned to me, his eyes locking onto mine. His smile widened, and he stood up, walking towards me. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "Stay away from us," I screamed, my voice breaking. But he didn't stop. He kept coming closer, his presence overwhelming, suffocating. I felt my vision blur, and everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the living room, surrounded by our photos. They were scattered everywhere, and every single one of them showed the man standing in the foreground, his face twisted into a cruel smile. Emma was in some of them, but in others, she was gone, replaced by him. I felt a wave of terror wash over me. I had to get out of here. I had to save Emma. I ran to her room, but it was empty. The bed was made, her toys neatly arranged, but she was gone. I searched the entire house, calling her name, but there was no answer. And then I saw it, the last photo we had taken. It was lying on the kitchen table, and there he was, holding Emma's hand, his eyes locked onto mine. I felt my knees give way as I sank to the floor, sobs racking my body. He had taken her. He had taken my little girl. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the photo, but when I finally looked up, I saw him. He was standing in the hallway, his eyes dark and empty, his smile twisted and cruel. "You can't take her," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Please, don't take her." But he just stood there, his smile widening. And then he disappeared, leaving me alone in the empty house, surrounded by photos of the family I had lost. I still have the photos. I can't bring myself to get rid of them, even though I know he's still there watching me. Every time I look at them, I see him. He's always there, always watching. And I know he's not done. I know he's waiting for me to join them. But I won't. I won't give him that satisfaction. I'll keep fighting, keep searching for a way to bring Emma back. Because I know she's still out there somewhere. And I won't stop until I find her. It was an ordinary Tuesday when I found the letter. I was 13 at the time, and life was as mundane as it gets for a kid my age. School, homework, video games, and the occasional scuffle with my younger sister, Stara. But that day, something strange happened. I came home from school to find a plain white envelope sitting on my desk. My name, Ethan, was scrawled on the front in what looked like my own handwriting. I tore it open, curiosity piqued, and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The message was brief and to the point. "Ethan, this is you from the future. There's someone you need to stay away from, no matter what. He's dangerous, and you'll know him by the scar on his left cheek. Whatever you do, don't let him into your house. Trust me, your future depends on it." I laughed at first. It had to be a joke, right? Someone was messing with me. Maybe it was Sarah trying to freak me out. But the handwriting, it was too similar to mine. My heart thumped in my chest as I read the letter again and again. Was this some kind of prank? Or something more? I stuffed the letter in my backpack and tried to ignore it. For the next few days, I kept telling myself it was nothing, just a silly prank. But the words haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about them. I started to notice little things. A shadow in the corner of my eye that vanished when I turned to look. Footsteps that didn't match anyone in my family's rhythm. I even found the letter in my backpack again, even though I was sure I had left it in my desk drawer. I was starting to lose sleep. Every creak in the house felt like a warning. Every stranger I saw made me anxious. I told myself I was being paranoid, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. It was a week after I got the letter that I saw him. I was walking home from school, and there he was, standing at the corner of my street. A man in his mid-30s, tall and thin, with a worn brown jacket and a scar running down his left cheek. My heart dropped. It was him, the stranger from the letter. He was watching me. I tried to act normal, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. I walked past him, my legs like jelly. He didn't say anything, didn't move. He just watched me with those piercing eyes. When I got home, I slammed the door shut and locked it. My mind was racing. Who was he? Why was he watching me? I ran upstairs, pulled out the letter, and read it again. It was real. All of it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside my window. A soft rustling, like someone was moving through the bushes. I wanted to look, but I was too scared. Instead, I pulled the covers over my head and squeezed my eyes shut. The next morning, I found another letter on my desk. This time, the message was even more urgent. He's close. He knows where you live. Do not talk to him. Do not let him in. I'm serious, Ethan. Your life depends on it. I was shaking as I read it. This was real. The fear was real. I could feel it deep in my bones. The next day, he came to my house. I was home alone, doing my homework at the kitchen table, when there was a knock at the door. My heart froze. I didn't want to look, but something made me get up and peek through the window. It was him. He was standing on my front porch, hands in his pockets, looking calm as ever. I ducked out of sight, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? What would I even say? The knocking continued, soft and steady. Then he spoke. Ethan, I know you're in there. I just want to talk. His voice sent chills down my spine. It was calm, almost friendly. But there was something else there, something dark and menacing. I clutched the letter in my hand, the words echoing in my head. Don't let him in. I backed away from the door and ran upstairs to my room, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial my mom's number. She didn't answer. I left a message, my voice trembling. Mom, there's someone outside. Please come home. I hung up and sat on the floor, trying to steady my breathing. The knocking stopped, and the house fell silent. I wanted to believe he was gone, but I knew better. I spent the next hour curled up in my room waiting. My mind raced with all the possibilities. What if he broke in? What if he hurt my family? The fear was suffocating, like a dark cloud pressing down on me. Then, out of nowhere, I had an idea. The letter had warned me not to let him in. But what if I could get him to go away? What if I could scare him off somehow? I crept downstairs, heart in my throat, and grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find. I held it tightly, the cold metal grounding me. I took a deep breath and opened the door a crack, just enough to peek outside. He was still there, standing on the sidewalk, staring at the house. I stepped out onto the porch, knife in hand, and shouted, "Leave me alone." He didn't flinch, didn't move, just stood there, staring at me with those cold, dark eyes. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the street. I watched him go, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the knife. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, I found a third letter. This one was different, though. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. He's not what he seems. He's dangerous, Ethan. I can't explain everything now, but you have to trust me. Whatever happens, don't leave the house tonight. Please, Ethan, don't leave. My heart sank. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I was in serious danger. I spent the day on edge, jumping at every sound, every shadow. When night fell, I locked all the doors and windows, checking them twice, just to be sure. I tried to stay calm, tried to convince myself that everything would be okay. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. I could feel it, like a dark presence hovering over me. It was past midnight when I heard the knock. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was the same soft, steady knock as before. I crept downstairs, my hands shaking, and peered through the peephole. It was him. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. What should I do? Should I call the police? My parents were still out of town, and I didn't know who else to turn to. The knocking continued, relentless. Then he spoke again, his voice calm and eerily reassuring. Ethan, I know you're scared, but I promise I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to talk. I clenched my fists, the letter's words echoing in my mind. Don't let him in. I stood there, frozen with fear, until the knocking stopped. The silence was suffocating. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. Then I heard it, a soft rustling, like someone was moving around outside. I crept to the window and peeked through the curtains. My blood ran cold. He was standing in the yard, holding something in his hand. It was a piece of paper, and he was holding it up to the window, trying to show me. I squinted, my heart in my throat, and read the words scrawled on the paper. "I'm not the one you should be afraid of." Confusion washed over me. What did he mean? Who was I supposed to be afraid of? I glanced at the letter in my hand, my mind racing. None of this made sense. Then it hit me. The letters were from my future self, right? But what if they weren't warning me about him? What if there was someone else, something else? I stepped back from the window, my mind spinning. If he wasn't the threat, then who was? My heart pounded in my ears as I tried to piece it all together. The letters, the warnings, his strange behavior. Then I heard it, a soft creak from upstairs. My blood ran cold. I wasn't alone. I turned and ran for the stairs, my heart in my throat. I had to get out, had to get help. But as I reached the top step, I froze. Standing at the end of the hallway was me. Or at least it looked like me. But something was wrong. His eyes were dark, empty, like two black holes staring into my soul. He smiled, a slow, chilling smile that made my blood turn to ice. "Hello, Ethan," he said, his voice a distorted version of my own. "I've been waiting for this moment." I stumbled back, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare. But it wasn't. He was real. I was real. And I knew, deep down, that he was the one I should have been afraid of all along. "I warned you," he said, taking a step closer. "But you didn't listen." I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in place by his gaze. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. A letter, my letter. "You sent this to yourself," he said, his voice cold and hollow. "But it wasn't enough. You still let him in." I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't let him in. He laughed, a low, chilling sound that sent shivers down my spine. Not him, Ethan. Me. Before I could react, he lumped at me. I tried to fight, tried to scream, but it was like fighting a shadow. He was everywhere and nowhere, a dark presence suffocating me, consuming me. I felt myself slipping, my vision blurring. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. I was standing in the hallway, alone, the house silent and empty. But something was different. I felt different. I looked down at my hands, my heart pounding in my chest. They were shaking, but not with fear, with excitement. I smiled, a slow, chilling smile that felt foreign on my face. I turned and looked in the mirror at the end of the hallway, and my blood ran cold. The reflection staring back at me wasn't mine. It was his. And in that moment I knew. I had become him. The letters, the warnings, the fear, it had all been for nothing, because I was the monster. I was the one to be afraid of, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. As I stood there, staring at my reflection, I heard a soft knock at the door. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, and smiled. It was just the beginning. We were a group of 6 close friends who had known each other since high school. There was James, the self-proclaimed leader, always full of confidence and adventure. Sarah, his girlfriend, was the calm and sensible one, balancing James's recklessness. Then there was Mark and Lisa, the pranksters who made every trip memorable with their jokes. Emily, our resident skeptic, often called the Debbie Downer, but we loved her all the same. And then there was me, the one who always ended up organizing these trips, mostly because I couldn't say no to James's insistence. This time, we decided to camp in a remote part of the woods. It was a place none of us had been before, secluded, untouched, perfect for a weekend escape. We packed our gear, loaded the cars, and drove for hours until the dirt road ended. From there, we hiked deep into the forest, laughter and chatter echoing among the trees. It felt like the beginning of one of those cheesy horror movies, but we brushed off the thought with jokes. After hiking for what felt like an eternity, we found the perfect spot. We set up our tents in a small clearing surrounded by tall, ancient trees. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground. We built a campfire, roasted marshmallows, and shared stories as the night grew darker and colder. The warmth of the fire, the smell of pine, the crackling of burning wood, it was the perfect getaway. But then Mark, with his usual flair for dramatics, decided to share a ghost story about a group of campers who disappeared in these very woods years ago. They say their belongings were found scattered in a mysterious tent, but no trace of the campers was ever found, he said, lowering his voice to a whisper. We laughed it off, but I couldn't shake off the strange feeling that settled in the pit of my stomach. The next morning, after a lazy breakfast, we decided to explore the surrounding area. We split into pairs and wandered in different directions, agreeing to meet back at camp by lunchtime. Sarah and I took the trail heading east, chatting about life and work as we made our way through the dense undergrowth. It was peaceful, just the sound of birds chirping and the rustling of leaves under our boots. About an hour into our hike, we stumbled upon something unexpected. In a small clearing, partially hidden by overgrown bushes, stood an old, worn-out tent. It looked abandoned, the fabric faded and torn in places. I felt a chill run down my spine as we approached it. "Do you think someone's still using it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. I shook my head, curiosity getting the better of me as I reached out to unzip the tent. What we found inside left us speechless. There, neatly arranged on the ground, were items that looked eerily familiar. A backpack with a patch from our school days, a water bottle with Mark's name scribbled on it, a book I had seen Emily reading last night. It was as if someone had replicated our belongings and placed them in this tent. But that was impossible. We had just packed these things ourselves this morning. "This can't be real," Sarah murmured, taking a step back. I felt my heart racing, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. We turned and ran back to camp, our minds struggling to make sense of what we had just seen. When we got back to the campsite, we found the others already there, looking concerned. We quickly explained what we had found, but as expected, they didn't believe us at first. James laughed, accusing us of trying to pull a prank. Mark and Lisa exchanged skeptical glances, but Emily's eyes were locked on mine, and I could see she was starting to believe. "Show us," James said, crossing his arms over his chest. "If it's really there, let's go see it." Reluctantly, we led them back to the clearing. The walk seemed longer this time, each step filled with a growing sense of dread. When we reached the clearing, I half hoped the tent would be gone, that we had imagined the whole thing. But it was still there, as unsettling as before. One by one, they stepped inside, the look of disbelief turning to shock as they recognized the items. "This is my backpack," Mark said, his voice shaking as he picked it up. "I've had this for years." "How?" "We need to leave," Emily said, her voice firm. "This isn't right. We should pack up and go." But James, ever the skeptic, refused to let fear get the better of him. "It's just a coincidence," he insisted. "Someone probably found these things in the woods and thought this was their camp. We're not going to let some old tent ruin our weekend." Reluctantly, we agreed to stay, but the mood had shifted. We couldn't shake off the unease that hung in the air. That night, we barely spoke around the campfire. The usual laughter and banter were replaced with nervous glances and hushed whispers. The next morning, I woke up early, the events of the previous day still fresh in my mind. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. As I wandered through the woods, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. There, tied to a tree, was one of our camping chairs. But it wasn't just any chair, it was my chair, the one I had been using all weekend. I knew it was mine because of the small tear in the fabric and the initials I had carved into the armrest years ago. I ran back to camp, my heart pounding in my chest. "Guys, you need to see this," I said, barely able to catch my breath. They followed me, and when they saw the chair, the color drained from their faces. "How did this get here?" Lisa whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "We packed everything up last night." "No one left the camp," Emily added, her voice trembling. "This doesn't make any sense." We checked our gear, and sure enough, my chair was missing. Someone, or something, had taken it during the night and moved it here. The realization sent a wave of panic through the group. "We need to go," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." But just as we were about to head back to camp, we heard it, a soft, eerie humming coming from deeper in the woods. It was a tune I recognized, something I had heard in my dreams but couldn't quite place. We froze, straining to listen, our hearts pounding in our ears. Without thinking, James started walking towards the sound. "James, don't!" Sarah called out, but he didn't stop. It was as if he was in a trance, his eyes glazed over as he moved towards the source of the sound. We'd followed him, fear gripping us as we pushed through the thick underbrush. The humming grew louder, more insistent, until we reached another clearing. There, in the middle of the clearing, stood an old, run-down cabin. The windows were boarded up, the door hanging off its hinges. The humming was coming from inside. We hesitated, fear and curiosity battling within us. James reached out to push the door open, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing in the silence. The inside was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of decay. "Maybe we should leave," Mark suggested, his voice barely a whisper. But James, stubborn as always, stepped inside. The cabin was empty, save for a single table in the center of the room. On it lay a dusty old journal, its pages yellowed with age. James picked it up, flipping through the pages, his eyes widening with each word. It's about us," he said, his voice shaking. We crowded around him, reading over his shoulder. The journal detailed everything we had done since we arrived in the woods, the campfire stories, the tent, even the chair tied to the tree. It was as if someone had been watching us, documenting our every move. "This is insane," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "How could anyone know all this?" We turned the pages slowly, the words growing more and more disturbing. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. "They're getting closer. Soon, they'll find what they're looking for. They mustn't leave." We stared at each other, the gravity of the situation sinking in. "We need to go," I said, my voice trembling. "Now." But as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. We jumped, our hearts racing as we tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as we pounded on the door, shouting for help, but there was no response. It was as if the woods had swallowed our cries. We were trapped. The windows were boarded up, and the door wouldn't budge. Our phones had no signal, and the nearest town was miles away. We were on our own. Fear turned to desperation as we searched the cabin for another way out. But there was nothing, just the rotting wood and the eerie silence. We huddled together, trying to come up with a plan, but it was hard to think straight with the fear gnawing at us. Hours passed, the sun setting outside, casting long shadows across the cabin. The darkness seemed to close in on us, the air growing colder and heavier. We lit a small fire in the fireplace, hoping the light would keep whatever was out there at bay. As the night wore on, strange things started happening. We heard footsteps outside, soft and shuffling, circling the cabin. The doorknob rattled, and the windows creaked, as if something or someone was trying to get in. We sat in silence, huddled together, our eyes darting around the room, searching for any sign of danger. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls, but it did little to dispel the fear that had taken hold of us. Then the humming started again, soft and melodic, coming from just outside the door. We froze, our hearts pounding in our chests. It was the same tune we had heard in the woods, the same eerie, haunting melody. "What do they want?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of here," Mark said, his voice barely audible. "We can't stay here." But as we tried to come up with a plan, the door creaked open, just a crack. We stared at it, fear gripping us as the humming grew louder, more insistent. And then we saw it, a figure standing just outside the door. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by the shadows. It stood there, swaying slightly, the humming growing louder and more frantic. We backed away, fear gripping us as the figure stepped into the cabin. It moved slowly, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it was struggling to control its own body. The humming filled the room, echoing in our ears, drowning out our thoughts. And then it stopped, its head snapping up to look at us. Its eyes were empty, hollow, and it reached out a hand long and bony, pointing at us. "Leave," it said, its voice barely a whisper. "Leave now, or you'll never leave at all." We didn't need to be told twice. We scrambled for the door, pushing past each other in our panic. The figure stepped aside, watching us with those empty eyes as we fled the cabin, our hearts pounding in our chests. We ran through the woods, not caring where we were going, just wanting to get as far away from that place as possible. The trees blurred past us, the branches scratching at our skin, but we didn't stop. It wasn't until we reached the campsite that we finally slowed down, gasping for breath, our hearts racing. We grabbed our gear, shoving everything into our bags, not caring what we left behind. "We need to go now," James shouted, his voice shaking. We didn't argue. We started running, leaving the campsite behind, the tents and the firewood forgotten in our haste. But as we made our way back through the woods, we realized something terrifying. We were lost. The trail we had followed to get here was gone, swallowed up by the dense undergrowth. Every direction looked the same, the trees looming over us like silent sentinels. Panic set in as we tried to find our way, but it was useless. The woods seemed to shift and change around us, the paths twisting and turning, leading us in circles. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring to keep us here. And then we saw it, the tent. The same old, abandoned tent we had found yesterday, standing in the middle of the clearing. But this time, there was something different. The flap was open, and inside, we saw our belongings, our backpacks, our clothes, even the food we had brought. It was all there, neatly arranged as if waiting for us. "We're trapped," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "We're never getting out of here." "No," James said, his voice shaking. "We can't give up. We'll find a way." But deep down, we all knew the truth. We were stuck in this nightmare, and there was no way out. We set up camp again, too exhausted to keep searching for a way out. The fire flickered weakly, the shadows closing in around us. We sat in silence, the weight of our situation pressing down on us like a heavy blanket. The humming started again, soft and melodic, coming from the trees around us. We huddled together, fear gripping us as the sound grew louder, closer. And then we saw them, the figures, moving through the trees, their eyes empty, their bodies swaying as they approached. They surrounded us, their hollow eyes watching us with a cold, detached interest. The humming filled the air, drowning out our thoughts, our fears. They moved closer, their hands reaching out, their fingers long and bony. We tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The forest closed in around us, the trees blocking our path, the shadows swallowing us whole. The figures moved closer, their eyes fixed on us, their hands reaching out. And then everything went dark. I don't know what happened after that. I woke up alone, the campsite empty, the fire long since gone out. My friends were gone, the only trace of them the belongings scattered around the old tent. I searched for them, shouting their names, but there was no answer. It was as if they had vanished, swallowed up by the woods. I tried to find my way out, but the forest seemed to stretch on forever, the paths twisting and turning, leading me in circles. I'm still here, trapped in this endless nightmare. The figures come every night, their hollow eyes watching me from the darkness, their humming filling the air. I don't know how long I've been here, or if I'll ever get out. But I know one thing, I'm not alone. I can hear them, my friends, whispering to me from the shadows, their voices faint and distant. They're here, trapped just like me, their souls lost in this cursed forest. And every night, I see the tent, standing in the clearing, waiting for me. I know what's inside now. I know what I'll find if I go in. My own belongings. My own end. And so I stay, trapped in this endless cycle, hoping for a way out, but knowing deep down that there is none. The forest has claimed us, and we are its prisoners, forever lost in the darkness. I remember the first time I heard the whispers. It was a Tuesday night, and I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep after a long day at work. My apartment was in an old building with creaky floors and thin walls, so I was used to the usual noises of neighbors moving around, pipes groaning, and the occasional car alarm outside. But this was different. It was faint at first, like a soft murmur just out of reach, coming from somewhere above my bedroom. At first I thought it was my imagination, just the random firing of a tired mind. I shrugged it off and turned over, pulling the covers up to my chin. But the whispers grew louder, distinct enough that I could almost make out words, though none of them made any sense. It felt like someone was having a conversation in a language I couldn't understand, right above my head. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. "Who's there?" I called out, feeling ridiculous as the words left my mouth. There was no response, just the continued murmuring that seemed to shift and swirl above me, like the voices were floating just out of sight. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was probably the wind through the vents, or maybe one of the upstairs neighbors had left their TV on. But the whispers didn't stop. They persisted night after night, always starting around midnight and fading away by dawn. After a week of sleepless nights, I decided to take action. I went upstairs and knocked on my neighbor's door. An elderly woman named Mrs. Parker answered, her face creased with concern when I told her about the noises. I don't have a TV, dear, she said, shaking her head. And I certainly don't hear any whispers. She even invited me into her apartment, and we stood in her bedroom, directly above mine. The silence was deafening, and I felt like a fool standing there, listening for something that wasn't there. I apologized and left, feeling more unsettled than ever. The whispers continued, and I found myself avoiding my bedroom at night, staying up late watching TV in the living room until I couldn't keep my eyes open. But even then, I could hear them, faintly, as if they were seeping through the walls, the words wrapping around me like a cold shiver. I was exhausted, on edge, and desperate. So I called a contractor, hoping he could find some logical explanation for the noises that were driving me mad. His name was Tom, a friendly guy with a scruffy beard and a tool belt that looked like it had seen better days. He listened to my story without interrupting, nodding thoughtfully as I described the whispers. "We'll take a look," he said, giving me a reassuring smile. "Old buildings like this, you never know what you'll find." He started with the usual checks, inspecting the walls and ceiling for cracks or gaps, tapping the plaster with a practiced hand. But nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I was beginning to think I'd imagined the whole thing when he paused, his head tilted as if listening. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice hushed. My heart skipped a beat. "Yes," I whispered back, feeling a strange mix of relief and fear. If he could hear it too, then I wasn't losing my mind. He grabbed a ladder and climbed up, pressing his ear against the ceiling. He stayed like that for a long moment, then climbed down, his face pale. "There's something up there," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What do you mean?" I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. "Let's just say it's not normal," he replied, his eyes darting to the ceiling. "I need to get into the crawl space above." "Do you have a way up?" I shook my head, my mind racing. The building didn't have an attic, at least not one that I knew of. But Tom was insistent, and together we searched the hallway, looking for any sign of an access point. Finally, we found a small, almost invisible door hidden behind a panel in the hallway closet. Tom pried it open, and a cold, musty draft wafted out, carrying with it the faint, unmistakable sound of whispers. "Stay here," he said, pulling a flashlight from his belt. "I'm going to take a look." I watched as he disappeared into the darkness, his flashlight beam bobbing like a distant star. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and I stood there, my heart pounding, listening to the low murmur of voices coming from above. Then suddenly, the whispers stopped, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I called out to Tom, but there was no answer. Panic gripped me, and I fumbled for my phone, ready to call for help when I heard a thud and a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor above. Tom's face appeared in the opening, pale and sweaty. He climbed down, his hands trembling as he wiped dust from his clothes. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his voice shaking. "There's a room up there, a whole hidden room, right above your bedroom." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process what he was saying. "What do you mean, a room? How is that even possible?" "I don't know," he replied, running a hand through his hair. "But it's there, and it's strange. There are no windows, no doors, just this small, cramped space filled with stuff." "Stuff?" I echoed, my curiosity piqued despite my fear. He nodded. "Old furniture, boxes and—" He hesitated, his eyes darting to the ceiling. "There are these dolls. Dozens of them, just sitting there, all facing the same direction." A chill ran down my spine. "What direction?" "Toward your bed," he said, his voice barely audible. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. This was too much, too bizarre to be real. But the look on Tom's face told me he wasn't joking. "I need to see it," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. Tom looked like he wanted to argue, but he just nodded and handed me the flashlight. "Be careful," he said, his voice tense. "There's something wrong about that place." I climbed up into the crawl space, my hands shaking as I pulled myself through the narrow opening. The air was thick with dust and the smell of mold, and I had to fight back a cough as I crawled forward, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. And then I saw it, a small, cramped room, just as Tom had described. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the floor was littered with old, rotting furniture and boxes. And the dolls, dozens of them, were lined up along one wall, their glassy eyes staring blankly ahead. I shone the flashlight around the room, my heart racing. There was something off about the place, something that made my skin crawl. And then I noticed it, scratches on the floor, like something had been dragged across it. My eyes followed the marks to the corner of the room, where a small, square hatch was set into the floor. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, to get out of there. But something compelled me forward, a morbid curiosity that I couldn't shake. I reached out and grabbed the edge of the hatch, pulling it open. A ladder led down into darkness, and I felt a surge of fear as I peered into the black abyss below. I couldn't see the bottom, couldn't hear anything, just an endless void that seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. I should have turned back. I should have left that room, called the police, done anything but what I did next. But I didn't. I climbed down the ladder, one trembling step at a time, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The air grew colder as I descended, and I felt a pressure building in my chest, like the weight of the darkness was pressing down on me. I reached the bottom, my feet touching solid ground, and I looked around, shining the flashlight in a slow arc. I was in a narrow, stone-walled passage, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. The walls were lined with shelves, and on each shelf there were more dolls, their faces pale and blank in the flashlight's beam. I moved forward, my heart pounding, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. The passage twisted and turned, leading deeper into the darkness, and I followed, drawn by a strange compulsion that I couldn't explain. And then I heard it, the whispers, louder now, echoing off the stone walls, surrounding me. I froze, my blood turning to ice as I realized they were coming from ahead, from somewhere deeper in the passage. I should have turned back. I should have run, but I didn't. I kept moving forward, my heart in my throat, my hands shaking as I held the flashlight in a death grip. The passage opened into a small chamber, and I felt my breath catch in my throat as I stepped inside. The walls were covered in strange symbols, painted in a dark, rust-colored substance that I didn't want to think too much about. In the center of the room, there was a small, crude altar, and on it, a single doll different from the others. It was old, its porcelain face cracked and yellowed with age, and its eyes were closed, as if it were sleeping. I stepped closer, the whispers growing louder, filling my head with a dizzying, disorienting hum. And then the doll's eyes snapped open, and I felt a scream rise in my throat as its head turned, slowly, to look at me. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest, and the whispers rose to a deafening roar, the words crashing over me like a wave. I couldn't move, couldn't think, just stood there, paralyzed with fear as the doll's mouth opened, and it began to speak. The words were gibberish, a twisted, guttural language that made my skin crawl, but the intent was clear. I was angry. I had disturbed something that should have been left alone, something that was never meant to be found. And then I felt it, a presence, cold and malevolent, wrapping around me like a vice. I tried to scream to run, but I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The darkness closed in, suffocating, and I felt myself slipping away, the world fading to black. When I woke up, I was back in my bedroom, lying on the floor, the morning light streaming through the window. I sat up, my head throbbing, and looked around, half expecting to see the dolls, the passage, the chamber. But there was nothing, just the familiar, comforting sight of my room. I could have convinced myself it was all a dream, a nightmare brought on by exhaustion and stress. But when I looked up, I saw it, a small, square hatch set into the ceiling, the faint sound of whispers drifting down from above. I left the apartment that day, left everything behind. I didn't care about the lease, didn't care about the money. I just packed a bag and drove, putting as much distance between myself and that place as I could. But the whispers followed me. I can still hear them, every night, just as I'm about to fall asleep. They're faint, almost imperceptible, but they're there, a constant reminder of what I found, of what I disturbed. And sometimes, when the night is quiet and the world is still, I hear something else, something that sends a chill down my spine and makes my blood run cold. Laughter. I should have never answered the phone that night. It was a typical Friday evening. I had just returned home from work, exhausted from the week's grind. I kicked off my shoes, poured myself a glass of wine, and settled into the couch to catch up on a TV show. It was one of those rare evenings when I felt I had nothing pressing to do, no obligations, no worries. But then the phone rang. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 11 p.m., too late for anyone to be calling, especially on my landline. I hesitated for a moment, thinking about letting it go to voicemail. But some inexplicable feeling, compelled me to pick up the receiver. "Hello," I said, my voice wary. There was silence on the other end, followed by a faint crackling sound. I was about to hang up when I heard a voice that made my heart stop. "Emma, is that you?" The voice was weak, barely above a whisper, but I recognized it instantly. It was my mother's voice, my mother who had died 3 years ago. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. My hand trembled as I gripped the phone tighter. "Who is this?" I managed to say, my voice cracking. "Emma, it's me, Mom. Please, you have to help me." The voice was unmistakable, but how could it be? My mother had died in a car accident. I had attended her funeral, said my goodbyes, and mourned her loss. This had to be some cruel prank, but who would do something like that? "This isn't funny," I said, trying to sound firm, though I could feel the fear bubbling up inside me. "Emma, I need you to meet me. Please come to the old house," she pleaded. Her voice was filled with desperation, a tone I had never heard from her before. I was frozen, my mind racing. The old house. She meant the house where I grew up, the one we had moved out of when I was a teenager. It had been abandoned for years, left to rot in the middle of nowhere. "Mom, you're dead," I whispered, as if saying it out loud would somehow bring sense to the situation. "I know, Emma. I know. But I need you to come. I don't have much time." The line went dead. I sat there, staring at the phone in disbelief. My heart was pounding, my thoughts a chaotic jumble. It couldn't have been real. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe someone was messing with me. But deep down, a small part of me believed it. I didn't know why, but I felt compelled to go. I grabbed my car keys and jacket, barely stopping to think. The drive to the old house was long and eerie, the roads deserted, and the moon hidden behind thick clouds. As I drove, memories of my childhood flooded back. The old house had always been a bit creepy even back then. My mother used to tell me it was because of its history, but she never explained further. When I arrived, the house loomed in the darkness, a shadow of its former self. The windows were broken, the paint peeling, and the garden overgrown. I almost turned back, but something pushed me forward. I stepped out of the car and walked towards the front door. It was ajar, creaking open with a soft push. The inside was dark, the air thick with dust and decay. I hesitated on the threshold, a part of me screaming to leave. But then I heard it. "Emma, upstairs." It was her voice again, distant and echoing, as if it came from the walls themselves. I swallowed my fear and climbed the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the top, I saw her. She was standing in the hallway, her back turned to me. She looked just like she had before the accident, her favorite blue dress, her hair neatly tied up. But there was something off about her, something that made my skin crawl. "Mom," I whispered, my voice barely audible. She turned around slowly, and I felt my blood run cold. Her eyes were empty, hollow, like two black pits staring back at me. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips were twisted into a sorrowful smile. "Thank you for coming, Emma," she said, her voice echoing in the stillness. I took a step back, my body trembling. "What do you want?" "I need you to help me," she said, reaching out her hand. "I'm trapped here, Emma. I need you to free me." I didn't understand. None of this made sense. How? She gestured towards a door at the end of the hallway, the door to my old bedroom. "In there. You'll find it." I felt like I was in a nightmare, everything surreal and twisted. But I found myself walking towards the door, my body moving on its own. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was exactly as I remembered it, frozen in time. My old bed, my posters on the walls, my toys scattered on the floor. But there was something else, something that didn't belong. In the middle of the room was a small wooden box, covered in dust. I hesitated, then reached out and opened it. Inside was a collection of old photographs, ones I had never seen before. They were of my mother, but in each one she looked different, angrier, more desperate. And then I saw it, a photo of her in the same dress she was wearing now, standing in this very room, her eyes filled with terror. I dropped the photo, my heart pounding in my chest. "What is this?" I asked, turning to face her. But she was gone. I was alone in a room, the air cold and oppressive. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. Something was very wrong. I needed to leave, to get out of this house. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut in front of me. I yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I pounded on the door, shouting for help. And then I heard it, a faint whisper coming from the box. I turned around slowly, my eyes wide with terror. The box was open, the photos inside rustling as if moved by an invisible hand. And then I saw it, a new photo, one that hadn't been there before. It was of me, standing in this room, looking at the box. I screamed and threw the photo away, my mind reeling. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? "Emma, please. Help me." Her voice was soft, almost a whimper. I turned and saw her standing in the corner, her body flickering like a glitch in a video. She looked sad, so sad it made my heart ache. "Mom, I don't know how to help you," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Destroy it. The box? It's keeping me here." I didn't know if I believed her, but I had no other choice. I grabbed the box and threw it on the floor, stomping on it with all my strength. The wood splintered, and the photos scattered across the room. For a moment, there was silence. And then, a deafening roar filled the room, a sound so loud it made my ears ring. The walls shook, and the lights flickered. I fell to the ground, covering my ears, screaming in pain. And then, it stopped. I looked up, my body trembling. The room was dark, the air still. I turned and saw her standing there, her body glowing faintly. "Thank you, Emma," she whispered, her voice fading. "I'm free now." And then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness. I sat there, my body shaking, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. I had freed her, but at what cost? As I drove home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was following me. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her face staring back at me. When I finally got home, I locked all the doors and windows, my heart racing. I tried to convince myself that it was over, that she was gone. But deep down, I knew it wasn't true. I went to bed, exhausted and terrified, hoping that I would wake up and find out it had all been a bad dream. But when I woke up, I found a single photo on my nightstand. It was of me, sleeping in my bed, with her standing beside me, her hollow eyes staring down at me. I screamed and threw the photo across the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew then that it wasn't over, that she was still with me. And every night since, I've heard her voice, whispering to me, begging me to come back. I don't know how much longer I can take it. I'm afraid to sleep, afraid to be alone. I've tried everything, burning the photos, leaving the house, even seeing a priest. But nothing works. She's always there, watching, waiting. And I know that one day she'll come for me. Because I didn't set her free. I trapped her. And now she's trapped me too. If you're reading this, please, don't come looking for me. Don't try to help. Because she'll find you too. And once she does, there's no escape. I never believed in fate. To me, life was a series of random events with no rhyme or reason. That belief changed the day I found the painting. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, the kind that makes you forget about everything else and just live in the moment. I was strolling through a local estate sale, half-heartedly browsing through old furniture, books, and knick-knacks when I saw it. It was leaning against the wall, almost hidden behind a dusty armoire, a painting of a woman. At first, I was drawn to the vibrant colors and the detailed brushwork, but then I looked closer and my heart stopped. The woman in the painting looked exactly like me. Same wavy brown hair, same hazel eyes, even the small birthmark on her left cheek. It was as if I was staring into a mirror, yet the expression on her face was one of deep sadness, almost despair. I had to have it. I didn't know why, but something inside me urged me to buy it. It felt like the painting was calling to me, begging me to take it home. The old man running the sale seemed surprised at my interest. "That's been here for years," he said, rubbing his chin. "Nobody ever noticed it before. You sure you want it?" I nodded, almost afraid he'd change his mind. He gave me a strange look but took my money and helped me carry it to the car. The painting was heavier than it looked, and I wondered what kind of wood they'd used for the frame. I hung it in my living room, right above the fireplace, It fit perfectly, almost as if it had always been meant for that spot. I found myself staring at it often, wondering who had painted it and why they had chosen a subject who looked so much like me. The more I looked at it, the more it seemed like the eyes followed me around the room, watching my every move. Days passed, and I began to notice something odd. The woman in the painting was changing. At first, it was subtle, just a few lines around her eyes, a slight graying of her hair. I thought it was my imagination, that maybe the light in the room was playing tricks on me. But as the weeks went by, the changes became more pronounced. The woman was aging. I, on the other hand, remained the same. I checked the mirror obsessively, looking for any sign of wrinkles or gray hairs, but there were none. I even asked my friends if they thought I looked different, but they just laughed it off, saying I looked as young as ever. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that it was all in my head. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I started having nightmares, dreams of the woman in the painting calling out to me, begging for help. Her eyes, once so full of life, were now hollow and sunken, her skin pale and wrinkled. In my dreams, she would reach out, trying to grab me, her fingers bony and cold. One night, I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly on edge, feeling like I was being watched. I decided to take the painting down, to put it away in the attic where I wouldn't have to see it anymore. But when I tried to lift it off the wall, it wouldn't budge. It was as if the painting had fused with the wall, as if it had become part of the house itself. Panic set in, and I tugged harder, but it was no use. I backed away, my mind racing. I had to get out of there, to get away from that painting, from whatever it was that was happening to me. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the house, not stopping until I was at the local library. I spent hours there, researching everything I could about the painting, about estate sales, about anything that might give me a clue as to what was going on. But there was nothing. It was as if the painting didn't exist, as if it had just appeared out of nowhere. Desperate, I went back to the estate sale, hoping to find the old man who had sold it to me. But when I got there, the house was empty, boarded up. A neighbor told me that the old man had died years ago, and that the house had been abandoned ever since. I felt a chill run down my spine. How was that possible? I had just seen him, had bought the painting from him with my own money. I didn't know what to do, who to turn to. I felt like I was losing my mind, like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. I started avoiding my own house, staying with friends, making up excuses about renovations and work. But no matter where I went, I couldn't escape the feeling that the painting was watching me, that it was waiting for me to come back. I couldn't stay away forever. Eventually, I had to go back. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was different. The air was thick, heavy, and the house felt colder than usual. I forced myself to look at the painting to see what had become of the woman. She was ancient now, her face gaunt and skeletal, her eyes sunken and lifeless. But it was her mouth that caught my attention. It was open, twisted into a silent scream, as if she were trapped inside the painting, begging to be let out. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I reached out and touched the painting. The moment my fingers brushed against the canvas, I felt a sharp pain shoot through my body. I pulled back, staring in horror as the woman in the painting moved. She reached out, her bony hand pressing against the inside of the frame, as if she were trying to push her way out. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I had to get rid of it. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and slashed at the canvas, but the blade passed through it as if it were made of air. The painting was unharmed, the woman inside still moving, still trying to escape. I fell to the floor, sobbing, feeling utterly helpless. I didn't know what to do, how to stop it. I could feel the weight of her gaze on me, feel her despair and anger seeping into my bones. I was trapped, just like her. And then I realized the truth. The woman in the painting wasn't just aging, she was dying. And as she withered away, I was taking her place. The lines on her face, the grey in her hair, it was all me. I was draining her, stealing her life force without even realizing it. I tried to stop it, to break the connection, but it was too late. I could feel her pulling me in, dragging me into the painting with her. My vision blurred, my body growing weaker with each passing second. I screamed, but no sound came out. The last thing I saw was her face, twisted in a grim smile, as she finally broke free, and I took her place in the painting. Now I'm trapped here, staring out from behind the glass, watching as the world passes by. I can feel myself aging, my body growing weaker with each passing day. I don't know how long I have left, but I know that when I'm gone, someone else will take my place. If you ever find a painting that looks like you, run. Burn it, destroy it, do whatever you can to get rid of it, because once you're in, there's no way out. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks. A remote cabin in the woods, no phone service, no internet, just peace and quiet. It sounded like the perfect getaway from the chaos of city life. I found the listing online, and the photos were breathtaking. Tall pine trees surrounding a quaint wooden cabin with a porch swing and a view of the mountains. It was everything I needed to unwind and clear my head. The drive up was uneventful. A long winding road that seemed to stretch forever, the trees closing in on either side. It was almost noon when I finally arrived. The cabin looked just like the pictures, maybe even better. The wood was worn but sturdy, and the smell of pine filled the air. I parked the car, grabbed my bags, and headed to the front door. The key was exactly where the owner said it would be, under a loose stone next to the welcome mat. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was cozy and rustic. A stone fireplace dominated the living room, and a small kitchen was tucked away in the corner. There was a single bedroom and a bathroom, both surprisingly well kept. A few old paintings hung on the walls, mostly landscapes and forest scenes. It felt like stepping into another time, a simpler time. I dropped my bags in the bedroom and decided to explore the cabin. The porch swing creaked under my weight as I sat down, taking in the view. The trees seemed to go on forever, a sea of green under the clear blue sky. There wasn't another soul in sight. Perfect. I spent the rest of the afternoon relaxing, reading a book I'd been meaning to get to. The silence was calming, almost hypnotic. Before I knew it, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the porch. I decided to head inside and make some dinner. I was rummaging through the kitchen cupboards, looking for a pot, when I noticed something sticking out from behind a stack of plates. It was a small, crumpled piece of paper. Curious, I pulled it out and unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. Do not stay past sundown. Leave now. I stared at the note, my heart racing a little. It had to be a prank, right? Maybe the previous guest was trying to spook me. I shrugged it off, chuckling at how easily I'd been startled. I tossed the note onto the counter and continued making my dinner. But the thought lingered in the back of my mind. What if it wasn't a joke? I shook my head, trying to focus on the sizzling sound of the pan. I was here to relax, not to get worked up over some silly note. After dinner, I settled down on the couch with a glass of wine. I glanced at the note again, still lying on the counter, and decided to throw it away. As I picked it up, I noticed something else. There was another piece of paper wedged under the bread box. I pulled it out, feeling a sense of unease wash over me. This one was longer, written in the same frantic scrawl. If you're reading this, it's too late. The woods aren't safe after dark. Stay inside. Do not open the door for anyone, no matter what you hear. And whatever you do, don't look at the trees. My hands were trembling as I read it. It had to be a prank. A really well-executed, elaborate prank. I tried to convince myself that it was just some local kids messing with me. But there was something in the handwriting, in the urgency of the words, that made my skin crawl. I decided to ignore it. I locked the door, checked the windows, and went to bed early. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the cabin seemed louder, every gust of wind against the windows more menacing. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting. I'd laugh about this in the morning. I woke up to the sound of scratching. It was faint at first, almost like a whisper. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal outside. But the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the front door. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. I glanced at the clock, 2:15 a.m. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like someone was dragging their nails across the wood. I remembered the note's warning. Do not open the door for anyone, no matter what you hear. I got out of bed, tiptoeing to the living room. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the sliver of moonlight filtering through the curtains. I stood there, frozen, listening. scratch, scratch, scratch. I took a deep breath and forced myself to move closer. I peered through the peephole, my hand shaking as I did. There was no one there, just darkness. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I turned to head back to bed, I saw it. Another note slipped under the door. I hesitated before picking it up, dread pooling in my stomach. They know you're here. They're coming. Do not look outside. Do not leave the cabin. I felt like I was going to be sick. This was no prank. The notes were coming from inside the cabin. Someone had to be inside with me. Panic set in, my mind racing. I grabbed the fireplace poker and did a quick sweep of the cabin, checking every nook and cranny. But there was no one. I was alone. I should have left then, packed my things and driven away. But where would I go in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere? I locked myself in the bedroom, barricading the door with the dresser. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, gripping the poker, listening to the silence, waiting for dawn. The morning light was a welcome sight. I felt foolish for letting myself get so worked up, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I had to know what was going on. Maybe there was a rational explanation, something I was missing. I decided to check the cabin thoroughly. I found nothing unusual, no sign of forced entry, no hidden passageways or crawl spaces. But then I remembered something. The basement. I hadn't checked the basement. The door was hidden behind a bookshelf, almost like someone didn't want it to be found. I hesitated before opening it, a cold dread settling over me. The stairs creaked as I descended into the darkness. The air was musty, filled with the smell of damp and decay. I found a light switch and flicked it on. The basement was small and cluttered with old furniture and boxes. But in the corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A small table with a notebook on it, surrounded by candles. I approached it slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. The notebook was filled with scribbles, frantic and disjointed. They're watching. They know. Don't look at the trees. Don't let them in. They can't come in unless you let them. I flipped through the pages, each one more chaotic than the last. The last entry sent chills down my spine. They're here. They want me to open the door. I can hear them calling my name. Don't listen. Don't open the door. They can't come in unless. The writing stopped abruptly, the pen dragging across the page. I slammed the notebook shut, my hands shaking. I had to get out of here. I ran up the stairs, nearly tripping in my haste. I grabbed my bags, not caring about the food or the wine. I just needed to leave. As I opened the door, I froze. There, on the porch, was another note. It's too late. I drove like a madman, the road blurring in front of me. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I had to get away. But as I reached the main road, I realized something horrifying. I was driving in circles. No matter which way I turned, I ended up back at the cabin. It was like the woods were swallowing me whole, refusing to let me leave. The sun was setting, and I felt a cold dread settle over me. I was running out of time. I parked the car and ran back to the cabin, my mind racing. I had to think, had to figure out what was happening. I locked the door and sat on the couch, trying to calm down. That's when I saw it. Another note, lying on the coffee table. You can't leave, not until they get what they want. My heart was pounding in my ears. What did they want? What were they? I glanced at the window, the sky outside darkening. And then I heard it. The scratching, louder this time, more insistent. It was coming from all around the cabin, surrounding me. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound. But it was relentless, like nails on a chalkboard. And then I heard it. A voice, low and guttural, whispering my name. John. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice was coming from inside the cabin. I looked around, panic rising, and then I saw them. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, standing just outside the window. Their eyes were glowing, staring at me with a hunger that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I had to get out, had to escape. But there was no way out. The shadows were closing in, their whispers growing louder. John, let us in. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest, and then I remembered the note. They can't come in unless you let them. I ran to the door, locking it, bolting the windows shut. But the shadows didn't stop. They pressed against the glass, their faces contorted with rage. "John, open the door." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the voices, but they were everywhere, inside my head, tearing at my sanity. "John, let us in." I don't know how long I stood there, trembling, my back against the door. But then, as suddenly as it started, the voices stopped. The scratching ceased. I opened my eyes. The cabin was silent. I took a deep breath, my body shaking with relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe they were gone. But then I heard it, a soft knock on the door. "John, please, we just want to talk." I knew I shouldn't open it. Knew that if I did, it would be the end. But something in the voice, something almost familiar, made me pause. "John, please, let us in." My hand was trembling as I reached for the lock. I don't know what possessed me, what made me do it, but I unlocked the door. The door swung open, and I was met with nothing but darkness. The shadows loomed in front of me, their eyes glowing with malice. And then they were inside, swarming around me, their whispers filling the cabin. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. They were all around me, their hands cold and clammy, pulling me down into the darkness. And then everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. When I woke up, the cabin was empty. The shadows were gone, and the sun was shining through the windows. But something was different. The air was heavy, suffocating. I tried to move, but my body felt sluggish, like I was moving through water. I glanced around, trying to make sense of what happened, and then I saw it. A note lying on the floor next to me. I picked it up with trembling hands, my heart sinking as I read the words. "You shouldn't have let them in. Now you're trapped, just like us. Don't try to leave. You'll only end up back here. And whatever you do, don't look at the trees. They're watching." I dropped the note, a sense of dread washing over me. I stumbled to the window, my legs shaking. I had to see, had to know. I pulled back the curtain and looked outside. The trees were the same, tall and imposing, their branches swaying in the breeze. But then I saw them. Faces, hundreds of them, peering out from the bark, their eyes hollow and empty. They were watching me, their mouths open in silent screams. And then they moved, their bodies twisting and contorting, reaching out towards the cabin. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I was trapped. There was no way out. And as I stood there, the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was never leaving. This was my prison, my punishment for letting them in. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor. And then I heard it. The scratching, faint at first, then louder, more insistent. Scratch, scratch, scratch. They were coming. And this time, there was no escape. I sat down on the floor, my back against the door, my heart heavy with despair. The darkness was closing in, the cabin filling with their whispers. And I knew, with a cold, sinking certainty, that this was the end. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The shadows pressed against the windows, their eyes glowing with malice. "John, let us in." And I knew, as the darkness swallowed me whole, that I was never going to see the light of day again. I never thought I'd be one of those people who ends up with a story no one would believe. You know, the kind where you're not sure if the person telling it is just insane or if there really are things in this world that we can't explain. But here I am, sitting in a nearly empty house, staring at the walls that have changed my life forever. It all started a few months ago, when I moved into this old house on the outskirts of town. I'd been looking for a place to call my own, somewhere quiet, away from the city noise. The house was a bit of a fixer-upper, but I've always been handy, so I figured it was a good deal. The previous owner had vanished without a trace, or so I was told by the real estate agent. She shrugged it off as if it were nothing, saying people sometimes leave without a word. I should have taken that as a warning. The first few weeks were uneventful. I was busy fixing the roof, painting the rooms, and just settling in. It was on a Wednesday evening when I first noticed it. I was coming back from the kitchen with a glass of water, and there it was, a small, barely noticeable carving on the wall in the living room. It looked like a symbol, something intricate but completely unfamiliar. At first, I thought it was some old mark left by the previous owner, a little quirk of the house. But then, a few days later, I saw another one. This time, it was in the hallway, near the staircase, and then another in the bathroom. They were all different, yet they felt connected, like parts of a puzzle. I even took pictures of them, trying to figure out what they meant. I spent hours on the internet searching for similar symbols, but found nothing that matched. One night, I woke up around 3 a.m. with this strange feeling, like I wasn't alone. The house was silent, too silent. I got out of bed and walked around, checking the doors and windows. That's when I saw it, a new carving, right next to my bedroom door. It hadn't been there when I went to bed. I was sure of it. I stood there, staring at it, my heart racing. The symbol was different from the others, more complex, almost like a warning. I couldn't read it, but I felt its message in my bones. I felt threatened. Over the next few days, the carvings started appearing more frequently. I'd find them in places I was certain had been cleaned just moments before. The kitchen counter, the back of a chair, even on the mirror in the bathroom. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to communicate with me. But I couldn't understand. I couldn't read the language, if it was even a language. I tried covering them up, painting over them, but they'd just reappear somewhere else, sometimes even more prominent than before. It was driving me insane. I began to dread coming home, fearing what new symbol I'd find and what it might mean. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I came home to find the living room walls covered in them. Hundreds of symbols, all carved meticulously into the plaster. I felt sick to my stomach. I called the police, thinking maybe someone had broken in, but they found no signs of forced entry. They looked at me like I was crazy, suggesting I might have done it myself without realizing it. Sleepwalking or something. But I knew I hadn't. I decided to install cameras. I had to know what was happening, had to catch whoever or whatever was doing this. For days, I stayed up, watching the footage, but saw nothing. The carvings would just appear, sometimes in the blink of an eye, as if the walls themselves were bleeding these symbols. I started losing sleep. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what the symbols meant, who or what was leaving them, and why. I felt watched, like there were eyes on me every moment I was in that house. The atmosphere grew heavy, suffocating. One evening, I decided to take a closer look at one of the symbols that had appeared in the hallway. As I ran my fingers over the carving, a chill ran down my spine. It was then I realized something terrifying. The symbols weren't just carved, they were burned into the walls. I could feel the slight ridges where the plaster had melted and hardened again. Whatever was making these carvings wasn't using any tool I knew of. The next day, I reached out to a friend who dabbled in the occult. I wasn't a believer in that sort of thing, but I was desperate. He came over, took one look at the symbols, and his face went pale. He said they were warnings, all right, but not just any warnings. They were wards, meant to keep something out, or in. He couldn't tell what, exactly, but whatever it was powerful and ancient. That night, I barely slept, clutching a baseball bat, as if it could protect me from whatever was hiding in the shadows. The house felt alive, like it was breathing, watching me. I could hear faint whispers, too quiet to make out, but unmistakably there. I tried to ignore them, but they were relentless, seeping into my thoughts. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I saw it. I was in the basement, looking for a fuse box, when I saw a shadow move out of the corner of my eye. It wasn't my shadow. It was something else, something wrong. It moved in ways a shadow shouldn't, slipping across the walls, darting from one corner to another. I ran upstairs, heart pounding, and slammed the basement door shut. I could feel it down there waiting. I didn't go down there again after that. Not for a long time. The carvings continued, spreading to the outside of the house, on the fence, the garage door, even on my car. I felt trapped, as if the house was consuming me, slowly but surely. I thought about leaving, selling the place, but something held me back. It was like the house wouldn't let me go. One night, I woke up to find my bedroom door wide open. The carvings on the walls seemed to shimmer in the darkness, like they were alive. I could feel a presence in the room, something heavy and malevolent. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to scream. I could feel it watching me, waiting. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually I blacked out. When I woke up, it was morning, and I was lying on the floor, my body aching. There were new carvings on the walls, right above where I had been lying. They looked different from the others, more intricate, almost like a message, a final warning. I knew then that I had to leave. Whatever was in the house, it wanted me gone. It was only a matter of time before it made sure I left, one way or another. I packed a bag and walked out the door, leaving everything behind. I drove away, not looking back, the house growing smaller in my rearview mirror. I've been staying at a friend's place since then, trying to make sense of what happened. I still have nightmares, and sometimes I swear I can see the symbols burned into my mind. I can't go back, but I can't move on either. I feel like the house is still with me, its presence lurking in the shadows waiting. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again. They're faint, but they're there. I don't know what they're saying, but I can feel their meaning. It's a warning. A warning that whatever was in that house, it's not done with me yet. I wrote this down because I need to believe that I'm not crazy, that it really happened. But I'm afraid. I'm afraid that the carvings will start appearing again, that I'll wake up to find them on the walls of this house, or on my skin. Because if that happens, I know I won't be able to run away again. And this time, I don't think I'll be able to escape. When I first arrived at my grandparents' house for the summer, I expected the usual boring routine, long days spent in the dusty attic, flipping through old photo albums, or endless hours watching the clock in the living room as the sun set behind the mountains. My grandparents lived in an old, creaky house at the edge of town, far away from my friends and any form of entertainment. It was the kind of place where the TV still had a dial, and the most exciting thing to do was chasing the stray cat that occasionally wandered into the backyard. But everything changed on that rainy afternoon when I stumbled upon the tunnel. It was raining heavily, and I had taken refuge in the basement. I was supposed to help my grandpa with cleaning up down there, but he had nodded off in his armchair after lunch, so I figured I'd explore a bit. The basement was filled with the usual stuff. Old furniture covered in sheets, stacks of cardboard boxes labeled in my grandma's neat handwriting, and shelves of canned goods that probably dated back to the 80s. I moved aside a dusty old rug, and to my surprise, found a trapdoor underneath. It was wooden, with a metal handle that had long since rusted. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pulled it open. A cold, musty breeze hit my face as I peered into the darkness below. It looked like a narrow set of stone steps leading down into a tunnel. I hesitated for a moment, considering whether I should wake my grandpa and ask him about it, but something inside me urged me to go down alone. Maybe it was the boredom, or maybe it was the strange feeling that this was something I was meant to find. I grabbed an old flashlight from one of the shelves and started down the steps. They creaked under my weight, but they held firm. The tunnel stretched out before me, a dark and endless path that seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. The walls were made of rough stone, and the air was damp and cold. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking when I noticed something strange. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought it was going to die. I shook it a little, and the beam steadied. But then I saw it, my hand. It looked different. Older. The skin was slightly wrinkled, and there were faint age spots that hadn't been there before. A shiver ran down my spine, and I turned around to go back. As I retraced my steps, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The tunnel seemed shorter now, and before I knew it, I was climbing back up the stairs and into the basement. I closed the trapdoor and leaned against the wall, my heart pounding. I looked down at my hands again, but they looked normal now. Shaking off the strange feeling, I decided to keep this little adventure to myself. After all, who would believe me if I told them? The next day, I couldn't get the tunnel out of my mind. I kept looking at my hands, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. But the more I thought about it, the more I convinced myself that it had been real. I had to know more. I waited until my grandparents were busy with their gardening. It was a perfect cover. They'd be outside for hours. I snuck back down to the basement and, with my flashlight in hand, opened the trapdoor again. This time, I decided to go further. I descended the stairs and walked deeper into the tunnel. The air grew colder, and the smell of damp earth filled my nose. As I walked, I noticed strange markings on the walls, symbols that looked ancient, almost like hieroglyphs. I had never seen anything like them before. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, but I kept going, driven by an inexplicable urge to see where it led. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. I looked down at my hands again and froze. They were definitely older now, the skin more wrinkled, and my knuckles knobby. Panic set in, and I turned around, sprinting back the way I had come. My heart was racing, and I could barely see through the tears that filled my eyes. When I finally reached the stairs, I practically flew up them, slamming the trapdoor shut behind me. I ran to the bathroom and looked in the mirror. I couldn't believe what I saw. I looked like I was in my late teens, maybe 18 or 19. My hair was slightly longer, and my face had lost the chubby look of a kid. I touched my cheeks, staring at the reflection in shock. What was happening to me? I needed answers, but I couldn't ask my grandparents. They would never believe me. Instead, I decided to search the house for clues. There had to be something that explained the tunnel and the strange things that were happening to me. I spent the next few days combing through every inch of the house. I looked through old photo albums, letters, and documents. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It wasn't until I was in the attic, going through a dusty old trunk, that I found something promising. An old leather-bound diary. It belonged to my great-grandfather, a man I had never met, but had heard stories about. He had been an explorer, always traveling to far-off places and bringing back strange artifacts. I sat down and started reading. Most of the entries were mundane, detailing his travels and experiences. But then, towards the end of the diary, I found something that made my blood run cold. He wrote about finding a tunnel beneath the house, a place he called the Passage of Time. He described it as a gateway to another realm, a place where time flowed differently. He had discovered it by accident and had entered it once, only to emerge years older. He warned that the tunnel was dangerous, that it took more than just time. The last entry was dated a few days before his death. He wrote that he was going back into the tunnel, that he had no choice. He didn't explain why, but his words were filled with fear. I closed the diary, my hands shaking. My great-grandfather had known about the tunnel, and it had terrified him. Even though I knew the risks, I couldn't stay away from the tunnel. It was like it had a hold on me, pulling me back to it. I tried to resist, but every day the urge grew stronger. It was as if something was calling me, something I couldn't ignore. One night, I finally gave in. I waited until my grandparents were asleep, and then I made my way down to the basement. I opened the trapdoor and descended into the darkness once more. This time, I didn't bring a flashlight. I didn't need it. The tunnel seemed to glow faintly, a soft light emanating from the strange symbols on the walls. I walked deeper and deeper, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I felt time slipping away, like sand through my fingers. My body grew heavier, my bones aching with every step. But I couldn't stop. I had to see what lay at the end of the tunnel. After what felt like hours, I saw it, a door made of solid stone, covered in the same symbols that lined the walls. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pushed it open. Beyond the door was a room, dark and cold. In the center of the room was a mirror, tall and cracked, its surface covered in dust. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. When I looked into the mirror, I gasped. The reflection staring back at me was an old man. His hair was gray, his face lined with deep wrinkles. His eyes were hollow, filled with a sadness that seemed to reach into my soul. I reached up to touch my face, and reflection did the same. I turned away, tears streaming down my face. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped, caught in this twisted place where time had no meaning. I had to find a way out, but how? I stumbled back through the tunnel, each step feeling like a lifetime. My body ached, and my mind was clouded with fear and confusion. When I finally reached the stairs and climbed back into the basement, I collapsed, too exhausted to move. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually I forced myself to stand. I needed to see my grandparents, to tell them what had happened. Maybe they could help me. But when I reached the living room, I stopped in my tracks. My grandparents were sitting on the couch, watching TV. They looked so old, much older than I remembered. My heart sank as I realized what had happened. I had been in the tunnel for years, maybe decades. Time had passed outside, even though it felt like only hours to me. My grandparents had aged, and I had missed it all. I turned and ran to the bathroom, desperate to see my reflection. When I looked in the mirror, I almost didn't recognize myself. I was an old man, probably in my 70s. My hair was white, my skin sagging. I felt a sob rise in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I had made a terrible mistake. I knew I couldn't stay. My grandparents wouldn't recognize me, and I couldn't explain what had happened. I packed a few things and left a note, telling them I was sorry, that I loved them, and then I left. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know what to do. I'm trapped in this old body with a mind that's still young. I don't belong anywhere, and I can't go back. I keep thinking about the tunnel, about what my great-grandfather wrote. He said it took more than time. I think I understand now. It takes your life, piece by piece, until there's nothing left. I don't know how much time I have left, but I know one thing: I'll never go back to that house. I'll never see that tunnel again. It's a place of darkness, a place where time has no meaning, and it will consume anyone who dares to enter. And yet, sometimes I still feel it calling to me. The urge to go back, to see if there's a way to undo what's been done. But I know that's just the tunnel's way of luring me in. So I keep walking, a stranger in my own body, haunted by the choices I made. I don't know how this will end, but I have a feeling it won't be good. Because the tunnel never lets you go. It's a part of me now, and I can't escape it. I first noticed something strange about my shadow a few weeks ago. It was subtle at first, just small things that I brushed off as tricks of the light or my own tired eyes. I work long hours as a graphic designer, often staying up late to meet deadlines, so I'm no stranger to hallucinations or weird things happening when you're sleep deprived. But this felt different. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed my shadow on the wall seemed off. I had just turned off the main light and switched on the dim lamp beside my bed. As I moved around, my shadow moved with me, as it should, but there was a slight delay. It was as if it hesitated before following me. I laughed it off at the time, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. Shadows can't move on their own, right? The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy. The memory of my shadow's delayed movement lingered in my mind like a bad dream. I told myself it was nothing and went about my day, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept glancing down at my shadow throughout the day, almost expecting it to do something weird again. But it didn't. It was perfectly normal. By the time I got home that evening, I had almost convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. But then it happened again. I was in the kitchen making dinner when I saw it. My shadow moved to reach for a knife before I even lifted my hand. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I stared at the wall, at the shadow that was supposed to be mine, yet it had moved independently, just for a split second. I dropped the knife I was holding and stumbled back, my pulse racing. "Get a grip," I whispered to myself, shaking my head. "You're just tired." I decided to ignore it. After all, what else could I do? Shadows don't move on their own. They're just shadows. I forced myself to finish cooking, trying to keep my eyes off the walls and floors where my shadow lacked. Over the next few days, I tried to go about my life as normally as possible, but the more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. Every time I turned my back, I could feel it. It was like a presence, a dark, looming presence that followed me everywhere. It would shift and twitch in my peripheral vision, just out of sight, as if it was mocking me. I started avoiding bright lights, sticking to dim rooms and shadows, hoping that if I couldn't see it clearly, it wouldn't act up. But it didn't help. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, trying to relax with a book, when I felt a sudden chill. My living room was dimly lit by a single lamp, and I was surrounded by shadows. I looked up, and there it was, my shadow, cast on the wall opposite me. It wasn't right. It was staring at me. I know it sounds crazy, but that's the only way I can describe it. It was just a shadow, a dark outline of myself, but I could feel it watching me. I dropped the book, my heart thudding in my ears. I got up slowly, keeping my eyes on the shadow. As I moved, it moved with me, perfectly in sync this time, but there was something about the way it did that sent shivers down my spine. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted out of the living room, ran to my bedroom, and locked the door. I felt ridiculous, but I didn't care. I sat on the edge of my bed, my body trembling. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to tell. Who would believe me? That my shadow was alive? I spent the night huddled under the covers, every creak of the house making me jump. I barely slept, and when morning finally came, I felt like I'd been run over by a truck. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't live like this. I called my best friend, Claire, and asked if she could come over. I didn't tell her why, just that I needed company. She showed up later that day, and I tried to act normal. We chatted, watched a movie, and I almost started to feel better. Almost. But then, as we were sitting in the living room, I saw it again. My shadow on the wall behind Claire. It was normal at first, just a dark shape cast by the overhead light. But then it started to move. Slowly, it lifted its arm, and I watched in horror as it reached out, extending towards Claire. I screamed, and Claire jumped, looking at me like I'd lost my mind. "What's wrong?" she asked, her eyes wide with concern. I pointed, my hand shaking. My shadow, it's... But when she turned around, it was normal again, just a shadow, matching my every movement. She looked back at me, frowning. "Are you okay?" I nodded, my mouth dry. "Yeah, I just thought I saw something. I'm fine." Claire left soon after that, giving me one last worried look before she walked out the door. I couldn't blame her. I probably looked like I was losing it. And maybe I was. The next few days were a blur. I tried to avoid my own home as much as possible, staying out late, hanging out in brightly lit places where shadows didn't seem so ominous. But I couldn't avoid it forever, and when I finally did go home, it was waiting for me. That night, I was in the bathroom, brushing my teeth when I felt it. A cold breeze brushed against my skin, and I looked up at the mirror. My shadow, cast on the wall behind me, was standing still, its arms at its sides. But as I watched, it began to move. It lifted its hand, slowly, deliberately, and reached out towards me. I dropped my toothbrush, stumbling back against the sink. I watched in horror as my shadow's hand, dark and indistinct, reached the edge of the mirror. And then it kept going. It stretched out from the wall, like a tendril of darkness, and touched the surface of the mirror. I felt a cold, clammy sensation on my skin, and I screamed. I bolted out of the bathroom, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I leaned against the door, my whole body shaking. "This can't be real," I whispered to myself. "It's not real." But it was, and it was getting worse. I barely slept that night, every creak and whisper of the house making me jump. I stayed in bed, the covers pulled up to my chin, too afraid to even move. I didn't want to see it again. I couldn't. The next day, I called in sick to work. I couldn't face anyone. I spent the day researching, desperately searching for answers. Was I crazy? Was this some kind of mental breakdown? Or was there something else going on? I found articles about shadow people, folklore about spirits that could take the form of shadows, but nothing that explained what was happening to me. Nothing that could help me. I felt more lost and alone than ever. That evening, as the sun set and my house was swallowed by darkness, I knew I couldn't avoid it anymore. I had to face it, whatever it was. I walked around the house, turning on every light, flooding every corner with brightness. But no matter how bright it was, there was always a shadow. I could feel it, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the lights to dim. I ended up back in my bedroom, the brightest room in the house with all the lamps turned on. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my shadow on the wall. It stared back, unmoving. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice trembling. It didn't answer, of course. It was just a shadow. But I could feel something, a presence, a weight in the air. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stand up. I walked towards the wall, my shadow growing larger as I got closer. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the wall. Nothing happened. It was just a wall. I let out a shaky breath, laughing a little at myself. I was being ridiculous. It was all in my head. I turned around, ready to leave the room, but then I felt it. A cold, clammy hand wrapping around my wrist. I screamed, jerking my arm away, stumbling back. I looked down, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. Just my shadow, standing still on the wall. But its arm was outstretched, its hand reaching towards me. I backed away, my heart racing. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. But I had felt it. The cold, the pressure on my skin. I hadn't imagined it. I ran out of the room, out of the house, and didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street. I stood there, panting, my breath visible in the cold night air. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go back in there. but I couldn't just leave either. It was my home, my life. I stayed with Claire that night, not telling her what had happened, just that I didn't want to be alone. She didn't ask questions, just let me crash on her couch, and I was grateful for that. But I couldn't stay with her forever. I had to go back. The next day, I returned home, my heart heavy with dread. The house was quiet, eerily so, and I hesitated at the door, my hand on the doorknob. I didn't want to go in, but I had to. I couldn't let it win, whatever it was. I pushed the door open, stepping inside. Everything looked normal. Just my house, my things, everything in its place. I took a deep breath and walked to the living room. My shadow was there, cast on the wall by the afternoon sun filtering through the blinds. It was still, normal, just a shadow, but I knew better now. I kept my eyes on it as I moved around the house, afraid to let it out of my sight. I was paranoid, I knew that, but I couldn't help it. I didn't want to be caught off guard again. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, every light in the house turned on, and waited. I didn't know what I was waiting for, but I knew something was going to happen. And it did. Around midnight, the lights began to flicker. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, deeper, and I could feel it again. That presence, that weight in the air. I stood up slowly, my eyes on my shadow on the wall. It was moving again, but this time, it wasn't just mimicking my movements. It was reaching out. I stumbled back, my legs shaking. "No," I whispered. "Please no." But it didn't stop. Its hand stretched out, longer and longer, reaching across the room towards me. I backed up until I hit the wall, my heart pounding in my ears. I could see it now, a dark, indistinct shape, stretching out of the shadow on the wall, reaching towards me. I felt the cold, clammy sensation again, and I screamed, pushing away from the wall, but it was too late. The shadow's hand wrapped around my wrist, pulling me towards the wall. I struggled, but it was like my strength was draining away, pulled into the darkness. "No." I screamed, thrashing against the cold, unyielding grip. "Let go of me." But it didn't. It pulled harder, and I felt myself being dragged towards the wall, towards the darkness. I could see it now, the shadow on the wall, rippling and shifting, like a black, gaping maw, ready to swallow me whole. I fought, but it was useless. I was pulled into the darkness, the world around me fading away. The last thing I saw was my shadow, standing there, watching me with eyes that weren't there. And then everything went black. I woke up in a place that wasn't my home. It was dark, so dark I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The air was cold and damp, and I could feel something, a presence, all around me. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My body was heavy, like I was weighed down by something. I could feel it then, the shadow, surrounding me, pressing in on me from all sides. It was inside me, part of me, and I was part of it. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I was trapped, lost in the darkness. And then I heard it, a voice, soft and whispery, like the rustling of leaves. Mine. I don't know how long I've been here, in this place in the darkness. Time doesn't seem to exist here. But I can feel it, the shadow, growing stronger, taking more of me. I can't fight it. I'm too tired, too weak. It's taken everything from me. I'm not alone though. I can feel others here, trapped in the darkness like me. We're all part of it now, part of the shadow. And it's hungry. It wants more. So if you see your shadow moving, if you feel that cold, clammy touch, run. Run and don't look back. Because once it touches you, once it takes you, there's no escape. You'll be trapped in the darkness, like me, forever. I remember the first night I saw them. It was late December, the kind of night when the chill seeps into your bones, and the snow blankets everything in a suffocating silence. I had just moved into this old house in a quiet town, hoping to escape the noise and chaos of the city. It seemed like a perfect place to start over, to find some peace. But I was wrong. It was a Sunday night, and I had fallen asleep on the couch while watching some old rerun. The crackling fire was the only sound in the house, apart from the wind howling outside. I woke up around midnight shivering. The fire had died down, and I decided to go upstairs to my bedroom. But something made me stop. There, on the window facing the backyard, I saw them, footprints in the snow. They were clear, perfectly outlined against the white blanket. My first thought was that some neighborhood kid was playing a prank, but when I looked closer, I realized they were adult-sized. They were also strangely precise, almost too perfect, leading straight from the edge of the yard up to my bedroom window. I walked over and peered outside, but there was no one there. Just the footprints, standing out starkly against the untouched snow around them. I couldn't see where they started. They just seemed to appear out of nowhere. My heart pounded in my chest as I pulled the curtains shut and tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I just hadn't noticed them earlier. That night, I barely slept. Every creak and groan of the house seemed amplified, and I found myself staring at the shadowy outline of the window, expecting to see a face pressed against the glass. But morning came without incident, and I brushed off my unease as paranoia. The next day, I shoveled away the footprints, thinking that would be the end of it. But they returned that night. Again, just outside my window. This time, I noticed something else. They were deeper, as if whatever had made them was heavier or had stood there for a longer time. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I hadn't seen or heard anything, yet there they were, clear as day. I called the police, feeling a bit foolish as I explained the situation. The officer who came out was polite but seemed unconvinced. He looked around the house, checked the locks, and reassured me it was probably just a prank. But when he looked at the footprints, I saw his expression change. He looked back at me with a frown. "These are odd," he said, scratching his head. "They don't lead anywhere else." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and fear. It wasn't just me imagining things. "Could be someone trying to scare you," he said finally. "But if they do it again, give us a call." I thanked him and watched as he drove off, his tire tracks quickly disappearing under the falling snow. I stood at the window for a long time, watching the footprints, half expecting them to move or disappear. But they didn't. They just stood there, an unsettling reminder that someone or something had been watching me. The following nights were worse. The footprints kept appearing, always in the same place, always leading straight to my window. I tried everything, setting up cameras, staying up all night, even scattering flour outside to catch any sign of movement, but nothing worked. The cameras showed nothing but an empty yard. The flour remained undisturbed, except for the footprints that reappeared every night without fail. I started to lose sleep, anxiety gnawing at me. Who would go to such lengths to play a prank, and why? The isolation of the house, which had once felt peaceful, now felt suffocating. I began to dread the nights, the silence, the darkness. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined something standing outside, staring in at me. One night, in a fit of desperation, I decided to confront whoever or whatever was doing this. I sat by the window, a heavy flashlight in my hand, my eyes glued to the yard. Hours passed, the only sound the ticking of the clock and the occasional gust of wind. My eyelids grew heavy, and I fought the urge to sleep. Then, just as I was about to give up, I saw it. A figure, barely visible against the snow, standing at the edge of the yard. My heart raced as I squinted, trying to make out any details, but the figure was too far away, shrouded in darkness. I took a deep breath and turned on the flashlight, shining it directly at the figure. For a moment, I thought I saw a face, pale and expressionless, staring back at me. Then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. I jumped up, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I ran outside, the cold air stinging my face, but there was no one there. Just the footprints, leading to my window, deeper than ever before. I stumbled back inside, locking the door behind me, my hands shaking. I knew then that this was no prank. Something was haunting me, something I couldn't explain. I felt a cold dread settle in my chest, and for the first time, I thought about leaving. But where would I go? And what if it followed me? The next few days were a blur. I barely ate, barely slept. I became obsessed with the footprints, checking them constantly, trying to find any clue, any sign of who or what was doing this. I called in sick to work, unable to focus on anything but the growing fear that consumed me. Then, one night, something changed. The footprints appeared as usual, but this time they didn't stop at my window. They continued around the house, stopping at the back door. I stared at them, my mind racing. What did this mean? Was it trying to get in? I checked the locks, my hands trembling. The door was secure, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I turned off all the lights and stood in the dark, listening. The house was silent, but I could feel something, a presence, lingering just outside. Then I heard it, a faint tap on the window. My heart leaped into my throat as I spun around, my eyes wide. There, in the darkness, I saw it. A hand pressed against the glass, pale and slender, fingers splayed out as if trying to reach me. I froze, my mind screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at that hand, feeling a terror unlike anything I had ever felt before. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. I stumbled back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I felt like I was going to be sick. I grabbed my phone and dialed the police, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely hit the numbers. When the officers arrived, they found me sitting on the floor, clutching my knees to my chest, my eyes darting around the room. They searched the house and the yard, but found nothing. No footprints, no handprints, nothing. Maybe you should stay with someone for a while, one of the officers suggested, his voice gentle. This place seems to be getting to you. I nodded numbly, but I knew I couldn't leave. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about the house. It was about me. The next few nights were a nightmare. I barely slept, jumping at every sound, every shadow. The footprints kept coming, and now they weren't just at the window or the door. They were everywhere, around the house, in the garage, even on the roof. I felt like I was losing my mind. Then one night, I heard it. A voice, faint and distant, calling my name. I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding. It came again, closer this time, whispering my name in a voice that sent chills down my spine. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window, but there was no one there. Just the footprints, circling the house like a predator stalking its prey. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I grabbed a coat and went outside. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I barely felt it. I followed the footprints, my breath fogging in front of me. They led me around the house, through the yard, and into the woods beyond. I don't know how long I walked. Time seemed to blur as I stumbled through the snow, my mind numb with fear and exhaustion. The trees loomed around me, their branches creaking in the wind. The footprints led me deeper and deeper, until I could no longer see the lights of the house. Then they stopped. I stood there, panting, my heart hammering in my chest. The footprints ended in a small clearing, surrounded by trees. I looked around, my eyes wide, but there was no one there. Just the snow and the silence, and the sense of something watching me. I turned to go back, but something caught my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the moonlight. I felt a jolt of fear as I realized it was the same figure I had seen that night, the same face, pale and expressionless, staring at me. I tried to speak, but no words came out. The figure stepped closer, and I saw its eyes, dark, empty, like two black holes. I felt a cold dread seep into my bones, freezing me in place. It raised a hand, pointing at me, and I felt a pull, like something was dragging me forward. I tried to fight it, but my legs moved on their own, dragging me towards the figure. I felt a scream build in my throat, but it died before it could escape. The last thing I remember is those eyes staring into mine and a voice whispering in my ear, "You can't escape." I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. For a moment, I thought it was all a dream. But then I saw the footprints, leading from the door to my bed, and I knew it was real. I don't know how I got back, or what happened in the woods. But I knew one thing, I couldn't stay here. I packed my things and left that morning, driving as far as I could, trying to escape the terror that haunted me, but it followed me. Everywhere I went, the footprints appeared. Outside my apartment, at the office, even in the middle of the city. They were always there, always leading to me. I tried to tell people, but no one believed me. They thought I was crazy, imagining things. But I knew the truth. Whatever it wasn't going to stop. It wanted me, and it wouldn't rest until it had me. I don't know how much longer I can run. I can feel it getting closer, its presence looming over me like a shadow. Every night, the footprints appear, deeper and darker, as if it's gaining strength. And now, as I write this, I can hear it. The soft crunch of snow outside, the faint whisper of my name. It's here, right outside my window, waiting for me. I don't know what it wants, or why it's after me. But I know one thing, I can't escape. No matter where I go, it will find me. And one day, it will get in. I don't know if anyone will ever read this or if it will matter. But if you do, please be careful. Don't let it in. Don't let it take you. I can hear it now, the soft tap on the window, the whisper growing louder. I know it's only a matter of time before it gets in, but I won't give it the satisfaction. I won't let it take me. I'm sorry. I remember the first time it happened like it was yesterday. I had just dozed off on my couch after a long, monotonous day at work. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the TV was still blaring some late-night talk show I didn't care to watch. I was exhausted, drained by the mundane routine of my life. It was supposed to be a normal night. But then I woke up. It wasn't on my couch, though. I woke up in a completely different room. My head was spinning as I tried to make sense of it. I was in a small, cramped apartment that smelled of mold and stale beer. The room was unfamiliar, and my heart started racing as panic set in. I jumped out of bed and looked around frantically. There were photos on the walls, photos of me, but they weren't from my life. In one, I was at a beach with people I didn't know. In another, I was holding a dog I'd never seen before. The confusion was overwhelming. I rushed to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and looked into the mirror. My reflection was the same, but everything else was wrong. I stumbled back to the bedroom and found a wallet on the nightstand. I opened it and pulled out an ID card. It was my face staring back at me, but the name was different, Daniel Foster. I flipped through the other cards, credit cards, a library card, a gym membership. They'd all had the same name, the same person, who was apparently me. Was I dreaming? I pinched myself, slapped my face, but nothing changed. My head throbbed as I tried to recall falling asleep on my couch. Maybe I'd hit my head and gotten amnesia or something. I sat on the bed, trying to calm down, but my mind kept spinning. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Then I fell asleep again, and when I woke up, I was back on my couch. Relief washed over me. I laughed, feeling stupid for how scared I'd been. It was just a weird, vivid dream. I brushed it off and went to bed, thinking that was the end of it. But it wasn't. The next night, it happened again. I fell asleep in my own bed, only to wake up in a different life, a small, cozy house with a family I didn't recognize. A wife, 2 kids, a dog that barked excitedly when I woke up. The woman, who apparently was my wife, called me John and asked if I was okay. I played along, still convinced I was dreaming. I went through the motions, pretending I knew what was going on. I fell asleep in that life too, and once again, I woke up back in my own apartment. At first, I thought I was losing my mind. Maybe I was having some kind of breakdown, or this was all some strange, elaborate hallucination. I tried to ignore it, hoping it would go away, but it didn't. Night after night, I woke up in a different life. A musician, a mechanic, a teacher, a soldier, and lived dozens of lives. Each one felt real, but none of them were mine. It became harder to keep track of what was real. I would wake up in my own bed, or what I thought was my own bed, and everything would be normal. But then I'd close my eyes for what felt like a second, and I'd be somewhere else, living someone else's life. It was disorienting, terrifying even. I stopped sleeping altogether, afraid of where I might end up. But eventually sleep would take me, and I'd be gone again. One night, I woke up as a doctor. The hospital was chaotic, patients screaming, alarms blaring. I felt a strange sense of familiarity as if I knew what I was doing. I went through the motions, performing surgeries, saving lives. I lived that life for what felt like weeks, and I started to forget my real life. It's strange, but I began to lose myself in those lives. Each one was more vivid, more real than the last. I started to feel the emotions, the pain, and the joy of these different versions of me. I made connections, fell in love, lost loved ones. I forgot which life was the real one. The lines blurred, and I was terrified I'd never find my way back. And then, one night, I woke up in a dark room. It was cold, and the only light came from a single flickering bulb overhead. I looked around and saw nothing but darkness stretching out in every direction. Panic gripped me. I called out, but my voice echoed back, hollow and empty. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My body felt heavy, like I was submerged in thick, black tar. A voice echoed from the darkness. It was soft at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder, filling the empty space around me. "You've been lost for a long time, haven't you?" it said. I tried to respond, but my voice was gone, swallowed by the darkness. "You've lived so many lives, but none of them are yours," the voice continued. "You can't remember who you are anymore, can you?" I struggled against the weight holding me down, but it was useless. I felt myself sinking deeper, the darkness closing in around me. "You're trapped here now," the voice whispered. "This is where lost souls end up. All those lives you lived, they were borrowed. And now it's time to pay the price." I screamed, but no sound came out. My mind was a swirling mess of memories, identities, faces, and names that didn't belong to me. I was losing myself, drowning in the countless lives I had lived. I don't know how long I was there, floating in that abyss, but when I woke up, I was in a different life again. I was lying in a hospital bed, tubes and wires attached to my body. A nurse was leaning over me, her face a mask of concern. "Mr. Daniels, you've been in a coma for months," she said softly. "Can you hear me?" I nodded weakly, my mind struggling to process what she was saying. Was this my real life? Had I been dreaming all those other lives? She explained that I'd been in a car accident, that I'd suffered severe brain trauma. The doctors hadn't been sure if I'd ever wake up. I listened, but it didn't make sense. I had memories of that life, of driving that car, of the accident, but I also remembered so many other lives. I didn't know which one was real anymore. When I was discharged, I tried to go back to my old life, but it didn't fit. The people, the places, everything felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just another borrowed life. I was constantly afraid that I'd fall asleep and wake up somewhere else. And then it happened. I woke up one morning and I didn't know who I was. I looked in the mirror and saw a stranger staring back. I couldn't remember my name, my past, or even the life I'd been living. Panic set in, and I tried to remember something, anything, but my mind was blank. All I had were fragments of other lives, jumbled and meaningless. I wandered through the streets, lost and confused. People passed by, oblivious to my suffering. I felt like I was fading, like I was becoming a ghost, slipping through the cracks of reality. That's when I heard the voice again, the same one from the darkness. "You don't belong anywhere," it whispered, echoing in my mind. "You're a wanderer, a lost soul." I screamed, clutching my head, but the voice wouldn't stop. "You'll keep waking up in different lives until there's nothing left of you," it said, almost mockingly. "And then you'll disappear completely." I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face. I was terrified, lost and alone. I didn't know what to do, where to go. Every time I closed my eyes, I was afraid I'd wake up in another life, another place where I didn't belong. And then I did. I woke up in a small empty room. The walls were bare, the floor cold and hard. There was nothing, no furniture, no windows, just a single door. I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked over to the door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, before finally pushing it open. I was back in the darkness. The voice was waiting for me. "This is your final stop," it said softly. "There's nowhere else to go." I collapsed, sobbing, my body shaking with fear and despair. I was trapped, lost in the endless maze of lives that weren't mine. I couldn't remember who I was anymore. I was just a collection of memories, identities that didn't belong to me. And then the voice whispered something that chilled me to my core. "You were never real," it said. "You were just a dream, a fragment of someone else's mind." I screamed, my voice echoing through the empty darkness. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down I knew it was true. I was just a shadow, a ghost of a person who never existed. I don't know how long I've been here, floating in this void, lost in the sea of forgotten lives. I don't even know if I'm real anymore, or if I'm just a dream trapped in an endless nightmare. But one thing is certain, I'll never wake up again. When Sarah and I first saw the house, we thought it was perfect. It was a charming little place on the edge of town, with a big yard, a cozy fireplace, and just enough room for the two of us to start our new life together. The price was suspiciously low, but we didn't care. We were ready to move in and make it our own. The day we moved in, everything felt like a dream. We were unpacking boxes, planning where to put the furniture, and imagining all the memories we would make. It wasn't until late afternoon that I noticed the letter on the kitchen counter. It was in a plain white envelope, unsealed, with our names written on the front in a hurried scrawl. Curious, I opened it and started reading. To the new owners, welcome to your new home. We hope you find it as comfortable as we did. But there's something you need to know. Whatever you do, never open the basement door. We're not sure what it is, but it's not worth finding out. Trust us, we learned the hard way. The Williams family. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I read it. Sarah looked at me puzzled. What's that? She asked. I handed her the letter, and as she read, her face turned pale. Is this some kind of joke? She asked, her voice shaking a little. I don't know, I replied, glancing around the kitchen as if expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. Maybe the previous owners were just messing with us. But something about the letter felt genuine. The handwriting was shaky, like it had been written in a rush. And the fact that they left it here, instead of giving it to us in person, made it even creepier. We decided to brush it off as a prank and got back to unpacking. But the thought of that letter lingered in the back of my mind. It didn't take long for us to find the basement door. It was in the hallway near the kitchen, an old, weathered wooden door with a rusted lock. I tried the handle out of curiosity, but it was locked tight. There was no keyhole and no way to see inside. Weird, I muttered to myself, running my hand along the surface of the door. Sarah came up behind me, peering over my shoulder. That must be the door they were talking about, she whispered, her eyes wide. Yeah, but why lock it like this? I wondered aloud. And why warn us about it? Sarah shrugged. Maybe it's just some old storage space, and they didn't want anyone messing around in there. Maybe, I agreed, though I didn't believe it. There was something about that door that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. For the next few days, we tried to ignore the basement door. We busied ourselves with unpacking and decorating, trying to settle into our new home. But every time I walked past that door, I felt it calling to me, like it was daring me to open it. A week after we moved in, strange things started happening. It began with small noises at night, soft creaks and groans that could easily be explained by the house settling. But then they became louder. Footsteps echoed from the basement, heavy and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. Sarah and I would lie in bed, listening to the sounds, too scared to move. Maybe it's just an old pipe or something, I suggested one night, though I didn't believe it myself. Pipes don't sound like footsteps, Sarah replied, her voice trembling. What if there's someone down there? I got out of bed and grabbed a flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. I'll go check, I said, trying to sound brave. No, don't. Sarah grabbed my arm. What if it's something else? I hesitated, looking down the dark hallway toward the basement door. The noises had stopped, and the house was eerily silent. We can't just ignore it, I said finally. I'll just take a look, okay? I won't open the door. She nodded reluctantly, and I made my way down the hallway, each step echoing in the quiet house. The closer I got to the basement door, the colder the air felt. I shined the flashlight at the door, and my breath caught in my throat. The lock was hanging open. I reached out and touched it, and it swung slightly under my fingers. I knew I had locked it after reading the letter. There was no way it could have opened on its own. I stepped back, my heart racing. Sarah, it's open, I called, my voice shaking. She appeared behind me, her face pale. What do we do? She whispered. I stared at the door, my mind racing. I wanted to open it, to see what was inside. But something held me back, a deep, primal fear that told me it was a bad idea. Nothing, I said finally, stepping away. We did nothing. We went back to bed, but neither of us slept that night. The next morning, we found the letter on the kitchen counter again. But this time, there was a new line added at the bottom. We warned you. Do not open the door. I stared at it, my hands shaking. This isn't possible, I muttered. How did it get here? Sarah looked terrified. Did you leave the door unlocked last night? No, I insisted. I locked it. I'm sure I did. We stood there, staring at the letter, unsure of what to do. I felt like we were being watched, like the house itself was alive, waiting for us to make a mistake. We should leave, Sarah said suddenly, her voice tight with fear. Leave? I repeated, stunned. We just moved in. Something's not right here, she whispered. We have to go. I wanted to argue to tell her we were being paranoid, but I couldn't. Deep down, I felt it too, an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to seep from the walls. "We'll go tomorrow," I said finally. "Let's just get through tonight." She nodded, and we spent the rest of the day avoiding the basement door, pretending everything was normal. But that night, the noises started again. It was worse this time. The footsteps were louder, more insistent, like something was trying to get our attention. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding. "Are you awake?" Suro whispered beside me. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely audible. "I can't take this anymore," she said, her voice cracking. "I feel like I'm going crazy." I reached out and took her hand. "We'll leave tomorrow, okay? Just one more night." She nodded, but I could tell she was barely holding it together. And then, without warning, the noises stopped. We lay there in the silence, too scared to move. I was just starting to relax when I heard it, a faint, scratching sound coming from the hallway. I sat up, my heart in my throat. "Do you hear that?" Sura nodded, her eyes wide with fear. We got out of bed and crept down the hallway, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The scratching was coming from the basement door. I shined the light on it, and my blood ran cold. There were scratch marks on the wood, fresh and jagged, like something had been clawing at it from the inside. "We have to leave," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Right now." I nodded, my mind racing. We turned to go back to the bedroom to grab our things, but as we did, there was a loud bang behind us. We spun around, and the basement door was wide open. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I took a step toward the open door. "Don't," Sarah cried, grabbing my arm. But I couldn't stop myself. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with something else. Curiosity and morbid need to know what was behind that door. I took another step and another until I was standing at the top of the stairs, staring down into the pitch-black basement. The air was cold, and I could hear something faint, like a low hum or whisper, coming from the darkness below. "Please, don't go down there," Sarah begged, her voice breaking. I turned to look at her, and in that moment, I felt a strange calm wash over me. "I have to," I said, and I meant it. I had to know. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The light from the flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, and I felt like I was descending into another world. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the smell was overpowering, a mixture of damp earth and something else, something foul. I reached the bottom of the stairs and shined the light around. The basement was empty, just a bare concrete floor and walls. But in the corner, there was a small door, half hidden behind a stack of old boxes. I walked toward it, my heart pounding in my ears. The door was old and rotting, and as I reached out to touch it, I felt a cold breeze seep through the cracks. "Don't," a voice whispered in my ear, and I jumped, spinning around. But there was no one there. I turned back to the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the handle. It was ice cold, and as I twisted it, I felt a strange resistance, like something was pushing back. With a deep breath, I pulled the door open, and the smell hit me like a punch in the gut. I gagged, stumbling back, and dropped the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And then I saw it. There was something inside the small room, huddled in the corner. At first, I thought it was a pile of rags, but then it moved. I froze, my blood turning to ice as the thing slowly turned its head toward me. It was human, or at least it had been once. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes were black pits that seemed to swallow the light. It opened its mouth, and a low, guttural moan escaped, sending a shiver down my spine. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to move. The thing crawled toward me, its limbs twisting at unnatural angles. I felt a scream rising in my throat, but it caught there, trapped by my own terror. "Help me," it whispered, its voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "Please." I backed away, my mind reeling. This couldn't be real. It had to be a nightmare, some twisted hallucination. But as the thing reached out to me, its fingers brushing my leg, I knew it was real. I turned and ran, stumbling up the stairs, the thing's raspy breathing following me. I burst into the hallway, slamming the basement door behind me, my chest heaving. "Sarah, we have to go," I shouted, but she was gone. "Sarah?" I called, panic rising in my chest. I ran to the bedroom, to the living room, but she was nowhere to be found. And then I heard it, the faint sound of her voice coming from the basement. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, no, no." But I knew I had to go back. I had to save her. With trembling hands, I unlocked the basement door and slowly descended the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears. The small door at the back of the basement was open, and I could hear Sarah's voice, faint and distant. "Please, help me," she called, her voice echoing in the darkness. I took a deep breath and stepped inside the small room. The thing was gone, but in its place was Sarah, huddled in the corner, her eyes wide with fear. "Sarah," I cried, rushing to her. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with terror. "Don't open it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't open what?" I asked, confused. But then I saw it, a small, ornate box sitting on the floor, covered in strange symbols. I felt drawn to it, like it was calling to me. "Don't open it," Sarah repeated, her voice breaking. But it was too late. I reached out and touched the box, and a jolt of electricity shot through me. The box sprang open, and a blinding light filled the room. I felt myself being pulled in, my body stretching and twisting, and then everything went black. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, I was back in the living room, the house eerily silent. I stumbled to my feet, my head spinning, and looked around. "Sarah?" I called, but there was no answer. I searched the house, but she was gone. The basement door was locked again, and the small room at the back was empty, the box gone. I tried to leave, but the front door wouldn't budge. The windows were sealed shut, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get out. I was trapped. Days passed, or maybe it was weeks. I lost track of time. The house was silent now, the footsteps and scratching gone. But I could feel it, the presence lurking just out of sight, watching me. And then one day, I found the letter again, sitting on the kitchen counter. But this time, there was a final message scrawled at the bottom. "You opened the box. Now you're trapped, just like us." I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the words. I was trapped, and there was no way out. The thing in the basement had taken Sarah, and now it was my turn. I could hear it at night, whispering my name, calling to me. I know it's only a matter of time before it comes for me too. So if you're reading this, please, whatever you do, never open the basement door. Don't make the same mistake I did, because once you do, there's no going back. When I moved into the apartment, I felt like I'd won the lottery. It was an old, charming place in the heart of the city, with wooden floors that creaked just right and big windows that let in the perfect amount of sunlight. I'd been searching for months, and finding this place felt like a dream come true. It was small but cozy, and I immediately saw myself calling it home. I spent the first few days settling in, unpacking boxes, and making the space my own. I arranged my bookshelves, hung up my favorite posters, and filled the kitchen with all the little gadgets I'd collected over the years. It felt good, like a fresh start. But there was always this odd feeling in the back of my mind, a sense that something was off. I brushed it off as just the excitement of being in a new place. I mean, who wouldn't feel a little strange in an old apartment in a new city? Then one evening, as I was rearranging some furniture in the living room, I noticed a loose floorboard near the corner of the room. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to pry it open. Beneath it, there was a small, dusty space, just big enough to hide something. I reached in and pulled out an old, leather-bound diary. It was worn, the leather cracked and faded, as if it had been hidden there for years. I sat down on the couch, holding the diary in my hands, feeling the weight of it. The pages were yellowed and smelled faintly of mildew. I wondered who it had belonged to and why they had hidden it. I opened it to the first page, my fingers trembling slightly. The handwriting was neat, almost too neat, as if the writer had been overly careful with each letter. January 3rd, 1982. The date made my heart skip a beat. It was over 40 years old. I read the entry, which was short and simple. The writer talked about moving into the apartment and how excited they were. I couldn't help but smile. It felt like a strange coincidence, almost like history repeating itself. But as I read further, the entries grew darker. The writer spoke of strange noises at night, footsteps in the hallway, and a feeling of being watched. They wrote about dreams that felt too real and shadows that seemed to move on their own. Each entry was more unsettling than the last, and I found myself unable to put the diary down. Then I reached the final entry. February 15th, 1982. I don't know if I can stay here anymore. The noises are getting louder, and I feel like I'm losing my mind. Last night, I woke up to find someone standing at the foot of my bed. But when I turned on the light, there was no one there. I can't take this anymore. I'm leaving tomorrow. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I read the words. It felt like a warning, like the writer had been desperate to get out. I flipped the page, expecting it to be blank, but my blood ran cold when I saw the date. February 16th, 2024. It was dated for tomorrow. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the page, my mind racing. It didn't make sense. How could there be an entry for a date that hadn't happened yet? I slammed the diary shut and tossed it onto the coffee table. I tried to convince myself that it was some kind of prank, that maybe someone had found the diary and written the date as a joke. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there was no way the diary could be predicting the future. But I couldn't shake the fear that had settled in my chest. I decided to go to bed and forget about it. Tomorrow would come, and everything would be fine. Or so I hoped. I barely slept that night. Every creak and groan of the old apartment seemed magnified, echoing through the darkness. I kept the light on, the diary still sitting on the coffee table, as if it was some sort of malevolent presence. By the time the sun peeked through the curtains, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I tried to shake off the unease as I went about my morning routine. I made myself a cup of coffee, showered, and got dressed for work. But no matter what I did, I couldn't stop thinking about that diary. I knew I should just leave it alone, maybe even throw it away, but something was drawing me back to it. Before I left for work, I found myself standing in front of the coffee table, staring down at the old leather cover. I hesitated, then picked it up and flipped to the last entry again, the one with today's date. My hands trembled as I read the words. I know what's going to happen. I've seen it. They're coming for me tonight. There's no way out. If you're reading this, get out while you still can. A shiver ran down my spine. I slammed the diary shut again, almost throwing it across the room in my panic. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. It had to be. I took a deep breath and forced myself to leave the apartment, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that had settled over me like a heavy blanket. Work was a blur. I could barely focus on my tasks, my mind constantly drifting back to the diary and its ominous message. I kept glancing at the clock, watching the hours tick by, each one bringing me closer to nightfall. I felt like I was in a fog, disconnected from everything around me. By the time I left the office, the sun was already starting to set. My heart pounded in my chest as I made my way back to the apartment, my mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts. I knew I should leave, that staying there was a mistake, but I couldn't bring myself to go. I needed to know what would happen. I needed to see if the diary was right. When I walked through the door, the apartment felt different. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. I turned on all the lights, trying to banish the darkness, but it didn't help. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I glanced at the clock. It was almost midnight. My heart raced as I picked up the diary again, my hands shaking. I knew I shouldn't, but I couldn't help myself. I opened it to the last entry, my breath catching in my throat as I read the words that hadn't been there before. It's almost time. They're here. I dropped the diary, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around the room, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. I felt like I was being watched, like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. I backed away from the coffee table, my mind racing. I needed to get out. I needed to leave before it was too late. But before I could take another step, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the apartment into darkness. Panic surged through me as I stood frozen in the dark, the diary lying open on the floor. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it did little to ease my fear. I felt trapped, like something was closing in around me. I knew I should leave, but my legs wouldn't move. It was as if the darkness had a hold on me, keeping me rooted in place. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but my heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear my own thoughts. And then I heard it. a faint sound, like a whisper, coming from the hallway. I turned, shining the light in the direction of the noise, but there was nothing there. I took a step forward, my heart in my throat. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, like voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. I reached the hallway and stopped, shining the light up and down, but it was empty. The whispering continued, echoing through the narrow space, and I realized it was coming from the walls. I pressed my ear against the plaster, my breath catching as I heard the voices more clearly. They were speaking my name. My blood ran cold, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping my phone. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I needed to get out. I turned and ran for the front door, my heart racing, but when I reached it, I found it wouldn't budge. I pulled and tugged at the handle, but it was like it had been locked from the outside. I turned back to the hallway, the voices still whispering my name, louder now, almost urgent. I didn't know what they wanted, but I felt like I was being pulled towards something. Against my better judgment, I found myself walking back down the hallway, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the walls. I stopped in front of the bedroom door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The whispering was louder here, almost deafening, and I felt like I was being watched. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was empty. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the shadows, but there was nothing there. The whispering had stopped, and the silence was suffocating. I felt like I was going to be sick, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw it. The diary lying open on the bed. I walked over to it, my hands shaking as I picked it up. The pages were blank, the neat handwriting gone. I flipped through the pages, my heart sinking as I realized they were all empty. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it wasn't good. And then the lights came back on. I jumped, dropping the diary on the bed. I looked around, the sudden brightness making me squint. Everything looked normal, like nothing had happened. But I knew it wasn't over. I could feel it, that sense of dread still hanging in the air. I picked up the diary, my hands still shaking, and walked back to the living room. I needed to get rid of it, to throw it away and forget about everything. But as I reached the coffee table, I froze. There was a new entry. My heart pounded in my chest as I read the words. It's too late. I dropped the diary, stumbling back. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything, but nothing added up. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I felt trapped, like I was being hunted. I turned to leave, but the front door was still locked. I tried the windows, but they wouldn't budge. I was trapped, alone in this apartment with something I couldn't see, something that wanted me. And then I felt it. A cold breath on the back of my neck. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no one there, just the empty room and the shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. I backed away, my mind racing, trying to figure out what was happening. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to dial 911, but there was no signal. The screen flickered, then went black. I cursed, throwing it onto the couch. I was trapped, completely cut off from the outside world. I felt like I was losing my mind. The diary lay on the floor, open to the last entry. I picked it up, my hands trembling. I didn't want to read it, but I couldn't help myself. The words seemed to burn into my mind as I read them. You can't escape, it's already too late. I dropped the diary, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I felt like I was being watched, like something was standing just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. And then I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, echoing through the apartment. I turned, my eyes darting around the room, but there was no one there. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I realized they were coming from the hallway. I backed away, my heart in my throat. The footsteps stopped just outside the living room, and I held my breath, my body trembling with fear. I felt like I was going to be sick. And then the lights went out again. I screamed, stumbling back. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. I reached out, trying to find something to hold on to, but there was nothing there. I was completely alone. And then I felt it. A cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The darkness seemed to close in around me, and I felt like I was suffocating. I needed to get out. I needed to leave, but I couldn't see anything. I fumbled for my phone, but it was dead, the screen completely black. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, like there was no way out. And then I heard it. A voice whispering in my ear. It's too late. I don't remember much after that. Everything became a blur of fear and panic. I remember running, stumbling through the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. I remember the cold, the suffocating darkness that seemed to wrap around me like a shroud. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, like I was caught in some endless loop, trapped in this nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. And then, suddenly, everything went quiet. I found myself standing in the middle of the living room, the darkness pressing in around me. I could barely see, my vision blurred by tears and fear. I felt like I was going to be sick, my whole body trembling with fear. And then I saw it. The diary, lying open on the coffee table. I walked over to it, my hands shaking. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I picked it up, my heart pounding in my chest as I read the final entry. I told you it was too late. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, dropping the diary. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I felt trapped, completely alone in this apartment with something I couldn't see, something that wanted me. And then I felt it. A cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. The darkness seemed to close in around me, and I felt like I was suffocating. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like I was frozen in place. And then I saw it. A shadow standing in the corner of the room. It was tall, dark, its eyes glowing in the darkness. I felt like I was going to be sick, my whole body trembling with fear. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow moved closer, its eyes fixed on me. I felt like I was being pulled toward it, like there was no escape. And then, everything went black. They found my body the next day, lying in the middle of the living room. The cause of death was never determined. There were no signs of struggle, no injuries, nothing that could explain what had happened. But they found the diary. It was lying open on the coffee table, the pages blank. They couldn't explain it, didn't know why it was there. They said it was just an old book, something that had been left behind by a previous tenant. But I know the truth. The diary wasn't just a book. It was a warning, a trap. It had been waiting for someone to find it, to open it, to read its words. And once you did, it was already too late. So if you ever find an old diary hidden away in some forgotten corner of your home, leave it alone. Don't open it, don't read it, because you never know what might be waiting for you on the other side. I had always been the kind of person who loved to explore places off the beaten path. When I heard about the small, uncharted island just a few hours boat ride from the mainland, I knew I had to go. The locals called it Isla Perdida, the Lost Island. The name alone piqued my interest. They said it was a place untouched by time, a hidden paradise where few dared to venture. I booked the trip without hesitation. The boat captain, an old man with a face weathered by the sea, gave me a long hard look before agreeing to take me. No one goes there anymore, he muttered as we left the dock. The people there are different. I brushed off his warnings, thinking it was just local superstition. How could an island so beautiful hide anything sinister? As we approached, I could see the island rising from the ocean, covered in thick, green jungle and surrounded by a pristine beach. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over everything. It looked like paradise. The moment I stepped onto the island, though, I felt a strange sense of déjà vu. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been there before, but I knew I hadn't. I chalked it up to the excitement of the adventure. I grabbed my backpack and started walking towards the small village nestled in the trees. The village was quaint, with small wooden houses and dirt paths winding between them. People stopped what they were doing and stared as I walked through. At first, I thought it was just because they didn't get many visitors. But then I noticed their expressions. Shock, confusion, fear. It was as if they had seen a ghost. "Can I help you?" A voice called out. An elderly woman stepped forward, her eyes wide with disbelief. She looked me up and down, her hands trembling slightly. "You shouldn't be here." "I'm just a tourist," I said, trying to sound as non-threatening as possible. "I heard about the island and wanted to see it for myself." She shook her head slowly. No, you've been here before. We all remembered you." A chill ran down my spine. That's not possible. I've never been here in my life. The villagers began to murmur among themselves, and I caught snippets of their conversations. It's him. He's back. He never left. Panic rose in my chest. I didn't understand what was happening. I think you're mistaken, I said, forcing a smile. I've never been here before. I promise. The old woman's face hardened. You should leave. Now, before it's too late. I didn't argue. Something about the way she spoke sent a jolt of fear through me. I turned and headed back towards the beach, planning to find the boat captain and get off the island as quickly as possible. But as I walked, I realized I was no longer alone. A group of villagers was following me at a distance, their eyes fixed on me like predators watching prey. I picked up my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the beach, the boat was gone. I was stranded. Panic surged through me as I spun around, trying to make sense of the situation. The villagers were still there, watching, whispering among themselves. I could hear the words "never left" repeated over and over again. I tried to reason with them. Please, there's been a misunderstanding. I don't know what you think I've done, but I swear I'm just a tourist. The old woman stepped forward again. You came to this island a long time ago. You never left. You were cursed, and now you're back. Cursed? I echoed, my voice trembling. What are you talking about? She pointed to the jungle. You'll find out soon enough. The island doesn't let anyone leave once they've seen the truth. I glanced back at the jungle, feeling a sense of dread unlike anything I'd ever felt before. I had no choice. I had to find a way to survive until help arrived. I decided to head into the jungle, hoping to find some place to hide, some way to make sense of what was happening. As I made my way through the dense foliage, I could hear the villagers chanting softly in the distance. The words were foreign, but the tone was unmistakable, ritualistic, ominous. I pushed forward, my body on high alert, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig setting my nerves on edge. After what felt like hours of walking, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center was a large stone altar, covered in strange symbols and surrounded by withered flowers. I approached it cautiously, drawn to it by some invisible force. As I reached out to touch the cold stone, a wave of memories flooded my mind. Flashes of faces, places, events, none of which I remembered experiencing, yet they felt so real. I saw myself standing on this very spot, surrounded by the villagers. I saw the old woman chanting, saw my own face twisted in fear as they bound me to the altar. And then darkness. I staggered back, clutching my head as the memories subsided. It didn't make sense. How could I have memories of something that never happened? The chanting grew louder, and I turned to see the villagers standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me with cold, expectant eyes. You're beginning to remember, the old woman said, her voice carrying over the clearing. The island's curse binds you to this place. You can never leave, not truly. You'll always come back. No. I shouted, backing away from them. This isn't real. It can't be. But even as I said the words, I felt the island's pull like invisible chains wrapping around me. I was trapped, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. I realized with a sickening certainty that I had been here before, countless times. I had left, or thought I had, only to be drawn back over and over again. Desperation clawed at me as I ran back into the jungle, ignoring the villagers' shouts. I needed to escape, to break free from this nightmarish cycle. I stumbled through the underbrush, my breath coming in ragged gasps, until I burst out onto the beach again. And there it was, the boat, the captain waiting for me. Relief flooded through me as I ran towards him. We need to leave now, I shouted. He didn't move, just watched me with sad, knowing eyes. It's no use, he said softly. You can't leave. Please, I begged, grabbing his arm. You have to help me. He shook his head. I'm just a part of the island's curse, like everything else here. You never left, and you never will. No. I screamed, the word tearing from my throat as I felt the ground shift beneath me. The beach, the boat, the captain, they all began to dissolve, like sand blown away by the wind. I was falling, the island consuming me whole. Darkness enveloped me, and I was back in the village, the old woman standing before me. Her eyes bore into mine, filled with a pity that made my skin crawl. Welcome back, she whispered. I collapsed to my knees, the truth crashing down on me. I had never left the island. I would never leave. No matter how many times I tried, I would always end up back here, trapped in this endless loop of fear and confusion. And then I remembered. The memories flooded back, one after another. Every time I had tried to escape, every time I had failed, the island had me in its grip, and it wasn't letting go. I looked up at the old woman, tears streaming down my face. Why? I choked out. Why me? She knelt down, her hand gently resting on my shoulder. The island chose you, she said softly. It's your fate. As I looked around at the villagers, their faces blurring together, I realized they were all like me, trapped, cursed to relive their arrival over and over again, never able to truly leave. The island was a prison, and we were its inmates. And then I knew. I would keep coming back, drawn to this place like a moth to a flame. I would keep forgetting, keep trying to leave, only to end up back here every time. It was hopeless. I felt a cold numbness settle over me as the villages began to fade, the island disappearing into darkness once more. I was alone, floating in an endless void, with only the memories of my past failures to keep me company. And then I was back on the boat, the captain staring at me with that same sad smile. Ready to go to the island? He asked. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The island loomed ahead, waiting, and I knew I would never escape. I would always return. I would never leave. I never used to be afraid of the dark. In fact, I found comfort in it. A quiet, soothing place where my thoughts could wander freely, where my imagination could come alive. But all of that changed the night I first saw him. It started out of nowhere. One night, as I lay in bed, I closed my eyes and saw nothing but the usual familiar darkness. But as I was drifting off, a sudden feeling of being watched jolted me awake. I opened my eyes, my heart pounding, and glanced around my room. Nothing. Just the shadows of my furniture, the glow of my nightlight casting a faint orange hue across the walls. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks. But the next night, when I closed my eyes, he was there. A dark silhouette standing in the distance, just barely visible, watching me. I thought I was dreaming, so I squeezed my eyes shut tighter, but he didn't go away. He just stood there, unmoving, like a statue carved out of the night. I snapped my eyes open, gasping for air, my heart thudding against my ribs. My room was empty. The silence was almost mocking, as if it were challenging me to find something wrong. But there was nothing. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself it was just a figment of my imagination, a trick of my tired mind. But every night when I closed my eyes, he was there watching. Each time I saw him, he seemed closer, his outline growing clearer. I could make out the broadness of his shoulders, the way he seemed to lean forward ever so slightly, as if he were trying to get a better look at me. I started sleeping with the lights on, but it didn't help. He was there, waiting in the darkness behind my eyelids, a constant, unblinking presence. I was too scared to tell anyone. Who would believe me? I barely believed it myself, but the fear was real, and it clung to me like a shadow, following me even during the day. I stopped sleeping. Every time my eyelids drooped and my vision blurred, I'd see him waiting. I forced myself to stay awake, drinking cups of coffee until my hands shook. But exhaustion caught up to me, and when I finally passed out, he was there. This time, I was too tired to wake up, trapped in that dark void with him. He stepped closer, his footsteps echoing in the empty space around us. My heart was in my throat, and I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I was frozen, my body paralyzed as he loomed over me. He reached out a hand, long fingers stretching toward me, and I jolted awake, drenched in sweat, my sheets tangled around me. I couldn't go on like this. I needed to know what was happening to me. I searched online for anything that could explain what I was seeing. Nightmares, sleep paralysis, hallucinations, they all seemed plausible, but none of them fit perfectly. I wasn't just seeing him in my dreams. I was seeing him every time I closed my eyes, even if just for a second. I stumbled across a forum for people who claimed to have similar experiences. They talked about shadow people, beings that existed on the edge of our reality, lurking in the corners of our vision. Most people saw them in fleeting glimpses, but there were a few who described something eerily close to what I was experiencing. They talked about being watched, about figures that got closer every time they saw them. And they all agreed on one thing: once you noticed them, they never went away. The more I read, the more terrified I became. I needed to know who or what this thing was, but I was also terrified of finding out. What if acknowledging him made it worse? But I was already losing my mind. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't function. My friends noticed my erratic behavior, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I jumped at every little noise. I made up excuses, stress, work, anything that sounded plausible, but I knew they didn't believe me. One night, out of sheer desperation, I decided to confront him. I locked myself in my room, turned off all the lights, and sat on my bed, trembling. I closed my eyes, and there he was, closer than ever, almost within reach. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" He didn't respond, just tilted his head slightly, as if he were considering my words. I swallowed hard, fear clawing at my insides. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst. "Why are you watching me?" I asked, louder this time. He took a step forward, and I felt a cold chill wash over me. His presence was suffocating, like he was sucking all the air out of the room. I forced myself to stay still, to keep my eyes closed, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. "Leave me alone," I begged, my voice barely a whisper. He stopped, his head still tilted, and for a moment I thought he might actually go away. But then he leaned closer, so close I could almost feel his breath on my face, even though I knew he wasn't really there. His voice was a low, raspy whisper, echoing in the darkness around me. "You invited me," he said, and I felt a cold, sinking dread settle in my stomach. I had never spoken to him before, had never acknowledged his existence, but somehow I had let him in. I opened my eyes, gasping for breath, but the room around me was empty. He was gone, but his words echoed in my mind. I had invited him, but how? And when? I spent the next few days trying to remember, going over every little detail, every moment when I might have let him in. But there was nothing, no clear answer, just a growing sense of dread that I couldn't shake. He was in my mind, in my thoughts, and I couldn't get him out. I could feel him watching me, even when my eyes were open, lurking in the shadows of my mind. I started to see him everywhere, in reflections, in the corner of my vision, always watching. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get away, had to escape, even if just for a little while. I packed a bag and left my apartment, driving aimlessly until I found myself at a small, run-down motel on the edge of town. I checked in and collapsed on the bed, my body heavy with exhaustion. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could sleep here, away from everything, away from him. I closed my eyes, and for a moment, there was nothing but darkness. And then I saw him, closer than ever, his face inches from mine. His eyes were dark voids, staring into me through me, and I realized with a sickening jolt that he wasn't just watching me anymore. He was inside me. I screamed and bolted upright, but the room was empty, my screams echoing in the silence. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He was inside my mind, and there was no escaping him. I tried everything, meditation, therapy, even medication, but nothing worked. He was always there waiting, watching. I stopped leaving my apartment, stopped talking to my friends. I was a prisoner in my own mind, trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. One night, as I lay in bed, too exhausted to fight anymore, I felt his presence again, closer than ever. His voice whispered in my ear, cold and mocking. "You can't escape me," he said, and I knew he was right. I had let him in, and now he was a part of me. I closed my eyes, tears streaming down my face, and he was there, smiling. His hand reached out, brushing against my cheek, and I felt a cold numbness spread through me. I was tired, so tired. I just wanted it to end. As his hand closed around my throat, I didn't fight. I let the darkness take me, his voice the last thing I heard as I slipped away. "You belong to me now." I never believed in fate or destiny. They'd always felt like words people use to explain away their bad choices or justify their fears. Life is what you make of it, or so I thought, until the day I found the book. I should have left it there, forgotten in the dusty corner of the library basement, but curiosity has a way of sinking its claws into you and dragging you into places you never wanted to go. It started like any other summer day. I was bored out of my mind, and the library seemed like a good place to kill some time. I'm not the type who reads a lot, but the air conditioning was on full blast, and it was better than sitting at home with my parents arguing in the next room. The local library wasn't anything special, just a small building with creaky wooden floors and a faint smell of mold. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to stumble upon something that could change your life. I'd been wandering aimlessly between shelves, skimming through random books when I saw it. A trapdoor in the floor, partially hidden behind a row of dusty encyclopedias. It wasn't locked, just stuck, as if it hadn't been opened in years. I glanced around, half expecting someone to yell at me, but the librarian was nowhere in sight. So I did what any bored teenager would do. I pulled the door open and climbed down. The basement was dark and musty, with shelves lined with old, forgotten books. It was the kind of place that seemed to swallow sound, making my footsteps echo louder than they should. I wandered deeper, running my fingers along the spines of books that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades, maybe centuries. That's when I saw it. The book was tucked away on a high shelf, its leather cover cracked and faded. There was no title, just strange symbols etched into the spine. I don't know why, but I felt this strange pull, like it was calling out to me. I reached up, pulled it down, and blew off a layer of dust so thick it made me cough. The pages were yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting inside was clear and precise, like someone had just finished writing in it. I flipped through the pages, my curiosity growing with each turn. The book was filled with detailed descriptions of events, some mundane, others downright bizarre. At first it seemed like a diary, but then I noticed something strange. Each entry was dated, but the dates were from the future. The first few entries didn't make much sense, just random events that seemed insignificant. But then I found an entry with today's date. A boy with dark hair and a curious mind will find this book in the basement of a forgotten library. He will open it, and his fate will be sealed. My heart skipped a beat. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out and tell me it was all a joke. But there was no one. Just me and that damn book. I should have put it back and walked away, but I couldn't. I kept reading, my eyes scanning the pages frantically. The next few entries were about me, little things that I had done earlier in the day, things no one else could have known. He will leave the library with the book, his mind buzzing with questions. Tonight, he will read it under the covers, fearing what he might find but unable to stop. I slammed the book shut and shoved it into my backpack. My hands were shaking and my mind was racing. How could this be happening? How could a book know what I was doing before I even did it? I left the library in a daze, barely noticing the concerned look the librarian gave me as I stumbled past her. That night, I did exactly what the book said I would. I waited until everyone was asleep, then pulled the book out from under my bed and started reading again. Each entry seemed more ominous than the last, detailing events that hadn't happened yet but felt inevitable. I read about a fight I would have with my best friend, a lie I would tell my parents, and a secret I would discover that would change everything. Each entry ended with the same phrase, "And his fate will be sealed." I tried to convince myself it was all a coincidence, that someone was playing an elaborate prank on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The book was real, and it was predicting my future, page by page. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't stop reading. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. You know it's going to end badly, but you can't look away. Then I reached the last page. My hands were trembling as I turned it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The entry was dated 2 weeks from now. I read it slowly, each word burning itself into my mind. He will be alone, standing at the edge of the old quarry. The night will be dark and silent, the air thick with anticipation. He will hear a voice calling his name, soft and familiar, and he will follow it to the edge. He will look down, his heart pounding in his chest, and he will see something moving in the darkness below. He will take a step closer, his curiosity overwhelming his fear, and then he will fall. His screams will echo through the night, but no one will hear them, and his fate will be sealed. I slammed the book shut and threw it across the room. My heart was racing, and I felt like I was going to be sick. It couldn't be true. It couldn't end like that. But deep down, I knew it would. The book had been right about everything so far. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that I still had 2 weeks to figure it out, to change my fate. But how do you change something that's already written? The next few days were a blur. I couldn't focus on anything. The book haunted my every thought, its words echoing in my mind like a twisted prophecy. I tried to avoid it, to forget about it, but I couldn't. It was like a shadow, always lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to pounce. I told my best friend, Sam, about it, hoping he would tell me I was crazy, that it was all just a big joke. But instead, he just looked at me with this weird, unreadable expression. "Maybe you should burn it," he said finally. "Just get rid of it." It seemed like a good idea at the time. I took the book out to the backyard that night and doused it in lighter fluid. My hands were shaking as I struck the match, my heart pounding in my ears. But as the flames licked at the cover, I felt this strange, overwhelming sense of dread. It was like the book was screaming, pleading with me to stop. I hesitated, the match hovering over the pages, and then I dropped it. The fire flared up for a moment, and then it was gone, the flames snuffed out like they'd never existed. The book was untouched, not a single page burned. I stared at it in shock, my mind racing. How was that possible? I picked it up, the leather cool and smooth under my fingers, and flipped it open. The words were still there, the ink dark and unyielding. I threw the book back into my backpack and ran inside, my mind reeling. It was like the book was mocking me, taunting me with its impossible knowledge. I didn't know what to do. I felt like I was losing my mind. I started having nightmares, vivid and terrifying. I would see myself standing at the edge of the quarry, the darkness below beckoning me. I would hear the voice calling my name, soft and insistent, and I would take a step closer, my heart hammering in my chest. And then, just as I was about to fall, I would wake up, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I tried to avoid the quarry, but it was like a magnet, pulling me closer and closer with each passing day. I would find myself standing at the edge, staring down into the inky blackness below, my mind filled with thoughts I couldn't control. It was like the book was inside my head, whispering its dark prophecies into my ear. And then, one night, it happened. I don't remember leaving the house. One moment, I was in my room, the next, I was standing at the edge of the quarry, the wind whipping through my hair. The night was dark and silent, the air thick with anticipation. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And then I heard it, the voice. It was soft and familiar, like someone I'd known my whole life. It called my name, over and over, each word like a hook sinking into my mind. I tried to resist, to turn away, but my feet moved on their own, carrying me closer and closer to the edge. I looked down, my eyes straining to see through the darkness, and I saw it, something moving in the shadows below. My heart was racing, my mind screaming at me to stop, but I couldn't. I took a step closer, my curiosity overwhelming my fear. The ground crumbled beneath my feet, and I felt myself falling, the world spinning around me in a blur of darkness and sound. My screams echoed through the night, but no one heard them. The last thing I remember is the cold, unforgiving darkness closing in around me, the sound of the wind howling in my ears, and the feeling of the book's pages fluttering against my skin, its words searing themselves into my mind. And then nothing. My fate was sealed. I don't know how long I've been here, trapped in this endless void. Time doesn't exist here, only darkness and silence. I can't move, can't scream, can't do anything but think about that damn book and the terrible fate it promised me. I should have left it there in the dusty corner of that forgotten library. But it's too late now. I'm trapped, a prisoner of my own curiosity, doomed to relive that moment over and over again. It was a Saturday afternoon when we found it. Mom, Dad, my younger sister, Emma, and I were going through old boxes in the attic, clearing out junk that had accumulated over the years. We had only moved into this house a month ago, and like with most old houses, there were always hidden corners filled with the belongings of previous owners. The attic was stuffy and dusty, filled with the scent of aged wood and mothballs. Sunlight filtered through a small window, casting a faint glow on the rows of dusty boxes. We were all sneezing and coughing, but Mom insisted we get it done. I remember the moment Emma called out, "Hey, what's this?" Her voice echoed in the attic, breaking the monotony of our rummaging. She was pointing at something behind an old wardrobe. Dad and I struggled to pull it aside, revealing a large cloth-covered object leaning against the wall. "Careful, don't tear it." Mom said as I carefully pulled the dusty cloth away. What emerged was a large, ornate portrait framed in dark wood. The painting depicted a man in old-fashioned clothing, staring directly ahead with piercing eyes. His face was pale, and his lips were thin, curled into a slight, almost mocking smile. "Who do you think he is?" I asked, wiping the dust off the glass covering the portrait. "Probably one of the original owners," Dad guessed. "Looks like something from the early 1900s, maybe even earlier." The man's eyes were what caught my attention. They were dark, almost black, with an intensity that seemed to go beyond the painting. It felt like they were staring right through me. I shivered and stepped back, but no matter where I moved, it felt like those eyes followed. "We should hang it up downstairs," Emma said, clearly oblivious to the creepiness of the painting. She had always loved old things, finding beauty in what I considered unsettling. "I don't know if that's a good idea," I murmured, still feeling those eyes on me. But my parents thought it would be a nice addition to the living room, adding character to the place. So, down it went, placed right above the fireplace in the living room. The rest of the afternoon was uneventful, but that night I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I sat in the living room, reading a book, I kept glancing up at the portrait. Each time, I swore the man's gaze had shifted, as if he was studying me, evaluating me. I shrugged it off as paranoia and went to bed, but my sleep was restless. I had dreams of walking through endless hallways, the man from the painting always just behind me, whispering my name in a voice that was both familiar and strange. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart racing. The next morning, I found Emma standing in front of the portrait, staring up at it with wide eyes. "What are you doing?" I asked, yawning and rubbing my eyes. "He's smiling more," she whispered, her voice almost reverent. I looked up at the painting. The man's smile did seem wider, more pronounced, and the eyes, there was something different about them, something more lifelike. "That's ridiculous, Emma." "It's just a painting," I said, trying to convince myself more than her. She gave me a skeptical look, but didn't argue. Over the next few days, things got stranger. The feeling of being watched was constant, and it wasn't just me. Mom and Dad began to avoid the living room, making excuses about needing to fix up other parts of the house. Emma, on the other hand, seemed drawn to the portrait, spending more and more time in front of it, whispering under her breath. I caught snippets of her conversations, but the words didn't make sense. She was talking to him. One night, I confronted her. "Emma, you need to stop this. It's just a painting. You know that, right?" I tried to sound calm, but my voice was shaky. "He talks to me, you know," she said, looking up at me with those big innocent eyes. "He says he's lonely. He's been alone for so long." "That's insane," I snapped, grabbing her arm. "You're scaring me." She pulled away, her face twisting into an expression I had never seen before, anger, but something else too, something darker. "You don't understand. He likes me. He said he wants to protect me." I was at a loss for words. I didn't know how to handle this, and every time I tried to talk to Mom and Dad about it, they brushed it off, saying Emma just had an active imagination. But I knew something was wrong. The house felt different, darker. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, and there were strange noises at night, whispers, like the sound of someone talking just out of earshot. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I sat up listening. They were slow, deliberate, moving from room to room. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and I could feel someone standing there, just on the other side. I mustered up the courage to get out of bed and open the door, but there was no one there. The hallway was empty, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I glanced toward the living room, and even though I couldn't see the portrait, I knew those eyes were looking at me. The next morning, I decided to take matters into my own hands. While everyone was out, I grabbed a hammer and went to the living room. I was going to destroy that painting, whatever it took. As I stood in front of it, I hesitated. The man's smile seemed almost mocking, daring me to try. I raised the hammer, my hands trembling, but before I could bring it down, I felt a force push me back. I stumbled, falling onto the couch. I stared at the painting, my heart racing. The man's eyes were glowing, a deep red, and I could hear a faint whisper in my head. "You don't belong here." I scrambled to my feet and ran out of the house, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for air. I didn't go back inside until my family returned. I told them what had happened, but they didn't believe me. Mom said I was just stressed, and Dad suggested I see a therapist. Emma just looked at me with that same twisted smile and said, "He doesn't like you." That night, I locked my bedroom door and pushed a chair against it. I lay in bed, my heart racing, trying to make sense of everything. I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of someone tapping on my window. I turned my head slowly, dreading what I would see. The man from the portrait was standing outside, his face pressed against the glass, his eyes glowing in the darkness. I screamed and backed away, but he just stood there, smiling that horrible smile. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I was lying on the floor, my body aching. I stumbled downstairs, my head pounding, and found my parents in the living room. They were standing in front of the portrait, their faces blank. Emma was sitting on the couch, her eyes glazed over. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "He wants us to stay," Emma said, her voice flat and emotionless. "He said we belong to him now." I felt a cold dread wash over me. I looked at the portrait, and the man's smile was wider than ever, his eyes filled with malice. I knew we had to get out of the house, but my parents were unresponsive, and Emma just kept staring at the painting. I ran to the front door, but it wouldn't open. The windows were sealed shut, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get out. It was like the house had come alive, trapping us inside. Days passed, or maybe weeks. I lost track of time. My parents stopped talking, their eyes vacant. Emma was always in front of the portrait, whispering to him, her voice growing weaker with each passing day. I tried to destroy the painting again, but every time I got close, something would stop me. My own body would freeze, my hands refusing to move. I was a prisoner in my own home, tormented by the man in the portrait. One night, I woke up to the sound of Emma's voice, calling my name. I stumbled out of bed and found her in the living room, standing in front of the painting. Her skin was pale, and she looked fragile, like she was fading away. "Please, help me," she whispered, her eyes pleading. "I'm trying, Emma, I'm trying," I cried, but I didn't know what to do. "He won't let me go," she said, her voice breaking. "He says I belong to him now." And then she was gone. She disappeared right in front of me, fading into nothingness. I screamed, pounding on the walls, but it was no use. The house was silent, except for the sound of my own sobs. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the empty space where my sister had been. The man in the portrait was smiling, his eyes filled with satisfaction. I'm the only one left now. My parents are gone, their bodies like empty shells, lifeless and cold. I'm trapped in this house, the man in the portrait always watching, always smiling. I can feel myself fading too, my strength leaving me. He's taken everything from me, and I know it's only a matter of time before I'm gone too. As I write this, I can see him out of the corner of my eye, his smile wider than ever. He's waiting for me, waiting for the moment I finally give in. I can't fight him anymore. I'm so tired, so very tired. If you find this, please destroy the painting. Don't let him take anyone else. I don't know how much longer I have. I can feel him pulling me, dragging me into the darkness. I hope someone reads this. I hope someone stops him. But for now, all I can do is wait. Wait and hope that my end comes quickly. And as I close my eyes, I can hear his voice, soft and cold, whispering in my ear. Welcome home. The darkness takes me. And then there's nothing. Nothing at all. I've been a police officer for almost a decade, and I've seen a lot of strange things, but nothing like what happened that night. It was a quiet shift, the kind that makes you almost wish something would happen just to break the monotony. I was sipping my coffee, listening to the soft crackle of the radio when the call came through. Dispatch to Unit 24, we've received a distress call from 308 East Hill Road. Please respond. I nearly choked on my coffee. 308 East Hill Road? That place had been abandoned for as long as I could remember. It was one of those houses everyone in town knew about but avoided. Stories of strange noises, mysterious lights, and disappearances surrounded it like a thick fog. The kind of place kids dared each other to go near, but never actually did. Unit 24, copy that, I responded, trying to keep the skepticism out of my voice. Be advised, Caller reported screams and strange noises before the line went dead. Use caution. I shook my head, wondering if some teenagers were playing a prank. It wouldn't be the first time. But as I drove through the winding, desolate roads leading to East Hill, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The house loomed at the end of the road like a dark, hulking beast. The moonlight barely penetrated the dense trees surrounding it, casting long, eerie shadows across the overgrown yard. The windows were boarded up, and the paint had long since peeled away, leaving only a skeleton of what once might have been a beautiful home. I parked the patrol car and took a deep breath before stepping out. The air was thick and cold, unusual for this time of year. As I approached the front door, I noticed it was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. I pulled out my flashlight and pushed it open with my free hand, the hinges groaning in protest. "Hello. This is Officer Jenkins with the Maplewood Police Department. Is anyone here?" My voice echoed through the empty house. There was no response, just the faint whisper of the wind through the broken windows. I shined my flashlight around the entryway. Dust covered everything, and cobwebs hung in every corner like ghostly decorations. The smell of mildew was overwhelming, mixed with something else, something metallic. I followed the beam of light into the living room. Old, decaying furniture was scattered around, and the wallpaper was peeling away in long strips. But what caught my attention was the phone, lying off the hook on a small table in the corner. The receiver was dangling, swinging slightly as if it had just been dropped. I swallowed hard, a chill running down my spine. Someone had been here. Recently. Is anyone here? I'm a police officer, and I'm here to help. I called out again, moving further into the house. There was a sudden noise from upstairs, a thump, followed by what sounded like faint whispers. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct told me to leave, to call for backup, but I couldn't just walk away if someone needed help. I slowly made my way up the creaking staircase, each step echoing through the silence. The hallway at the top was dark, and the air was even colder than downstairs. I could see my breath in front of me, small clouds of mist forming and disappearing as I breathed. The door at the end of the hallway was slightly open, and I could see a faint light coming from inside. I approached cautiously, my hand resting on the handle of my gun. As I nudged the door open, the light flickered and then went out, plunging the room into darkness. "Damn it," I muttered, shining my flashlight into the room. It was a bedroom, or at least it used to be. The bed was old and broken, the mattress ripped open and spilling its contents onto the floor. The walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn hastily in what looked like blood. My stomach turned as I realized that the metallic smell I'd noticed earlier was coming from here. But the worst part was the mirror on the far wall. It was cracked, and in the dim light of my flashlight, I could see my reflection, except it wasn't just me. There was something behind me, something dark and twisted, its eyes glowing a sickly yellow. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just empty air and shadows. My heart was racing, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back despite the cold. I turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. It was just my own terrified reflection staring back at me. "Okay, this is insane," I whispered to myself, backing out of the room. As I turned to head back down the hall, I heard it again, the faint sound of whispers. But this time, they were coming from all around me, like a dozen voices speaking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but they seemed to be getting louder, more insistent. I hurried down the stairs, my heart in my throat. I needed to get out of this place. Whatever was going on here, it wasn't something I could handle on my own. As I reached the front door, it slammed shut in my face with a force that rattled the windows. I yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as I tried to force it open, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps. The whispers were louder now, echoing through the house like a chorus of the damned. I spun around, my flashlight flickering as if it was struggling to stay on. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a single voice spoke, clear and cold. "You shouldn't have come here." The words sent a bolt of terror through me. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I backed away from the door, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The shadows seemed to be moving, closing in around me. I stumbled into the living room. tripping over something and falling to the floor. My flashlight rolled away, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. I could hear footsteps now, heavy and slow, approaching from somewhere deeper in the house. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting around for any escape. The windows were boarded up tight, and the door was still jammed. I was trapped. The footsteps were closer now, just outside the living room. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart pounding so loud I was sure it would give me away. The room was filled with shadows, shifting and twisting in the dim light. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. It was the same one I'd seen in the mirror, tall, gaunt, and twisted, its eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if it had all the time in the world. I froze, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hallucination, a trick of the light. But as it moved closer, I could feel its presence, a cold, suffocating weight pressing down on me. "You don't belong here," it whispered, its voice echoing through the empty house. I tried to speak, to say something, anything, but my mouth was dry, and no words came out. I backed away, my eyes locked on the creature as it advanced. "Leave this place," it hissed, raising a long bony hand. I felt a force slam into me, throwing me back against the wall. Pain exploded in my side, and I gasped, clutching my ribs. The thing moved closer, its eyes never leaving mine. I could feel its breath, cold and foul, as it leaned in. "You were warned," it whispered, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the end. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence was gone. The house was silent again, the shadows still. I opened my eyes, blinking in confusion. The creature was gone, but the fear remained, a cold knot in my chest. I stumbled to my feet, my entire body trembling. I had to get out of here. Now. I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the door, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't care if it was locked. I would break it down if I had to. But as I reached for the handle, the door swung open on its own, almost invitingly. I didn't stop to question it. I bolted outside, my feet pounding against the ground as I ran to my patrol car. I threw myself inside, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. As the engine roared to life, I glanced back at the house. It stood there, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. There was something in there, something that should never have been disturbed. I didn't stop driving until I was back at the station. I sat in the parking lot for a long time, trying to calm my racing heart. I wanted to report what had happened, to tell someone, but what could I say? That I'd been attacked by a ghost? That something had spoken to me warned me. No one would believe me. Hell, I didn't even believe it myself. But I knew one thing for sure. I was never going back to that house. Whatever was in there, it was best left alone. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, my legs still shaky. I could see the faint glow of dawn on the horizon, the promise of a new day. But the events of that night would haunt me forever. And as I walked into the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Something that had followed me back from that house, something that would never let me go. I shivered, glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there, just shadows. But I knew, deep down, that I would never be alone again. Whatever I'd awakened in that house, it was with me now, and it would be with me forever.